before he became the man who painted the Mona Lisa. Leonardo da Vinci was a poor, illegitimate child, banned from school, shamed by his own name, and starving for knowledge. In a world that told him he would be nothing, he imagined everything. In the year 1452, the world was dying in the dark. Picture it. Not the Renaissance you imagine from paintings and palaces, but the real Europe. Streets slick with waste. Bodies piled in mass graves from the plague that had carved through a third of the continent just decades before. The air thick with smoke from tallow candles and the stench of unwashed humanity packed into crumbling stone cities. This was a world where most people never traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born. Where reading was a skill reserved for priests and nobles. Where the human body was a mystery locked behind the doors of the church, and to question God's design was to risk your life. This was a world imprisoned by its own ignorance. Superstition ruled everything. If your crops failed, it was witchcraft. If disease struck your family, it was God's punishment. Medicine meant leeches and prayers. Science meant alchemy and astrology. The earth was flat in most minds, the center of a universe that revolved around human sin and divine judgment. To dream beyond what the church permitted was not just forbidden, it was dangerous. In this suffocating darkness, in a small village tucked into the hills of Tuscany, a child was born who would shatter everything. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Here's what gets polished away by time and myth. Leonardo da Vinci didn't arrive as a genius. He arrived as nothing. Less than nothing. He was born a bastard, the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman, in a society that would spend his entire life reminding him he didn't belong. He was born without a name that meant anything, without money, without access to the education that shaped great men, without even the legal right to inherit his father's profession. How does a boy with nothing become everything? That is the story. Not the story of a man touched by divine inspiration, floating above humanity in a cloud of effortless brilliance. No, this is the story of brutal poverty, of hunger, of a mind so vast it threatened to consume itself, of a man who survived by seeing what others couldn't, who transformed deprivation into liberation, who turned his exclusion from the world into a reason to reinvent it entirely. This is the story of how Leonardo da Vinci didn't just survive poverty. He weaponized it. The village of Vinci sits on a hillside, looking down over olive groves and vineyards that stretch toward Florence, about 20 miles to the east. It's a nothing place, a cluster of stone houses, a church, some workshops, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone else's business, and your family name determines your entire life before you even learn to walk. In April of 1452, on a Saturday night, a woman named Caterina gave birth to a baby boy. She was a peasant. Some records suggest she might have been a slave from the Middle East. What we know for certain is that she was poor, unmarried, and alone when the labor pains began. The father was Piero da Vinci, a 25-year-old notary from a respectable family. Respectable enough that when Caterina became pregnant, there was never any question of marriage. You didn't marry peasants. You didn't marry slaves. You certainly didn't marry them when doing so would destroy your career before it began. So Piero acknowledged the child, fulfilled his legal obligation to support him minimally, and then married a woman from his own class within months of Leonardo's birth. A proper woman. A woman with a dowry. And Caterina? She was married off to a local laborer, a man named Acatabriga, and moved to a different village. The baby stayed with Piero's family, but make no mistake about his status. In the house of his father, Leonardo was tolerated, provided for in the most basic sense. But he was not truly part of the family. He was evidence of his father's indiscretion, a reminder of sin. The illegitimate child who could never inherit, never practice law like his father, never attend the Latin schools where the sons of legitimate families learned the classics that would open doors to the church, to medicine, to the universities, to power. This rejection, this fundamental exclusion from the social systems that defined success in 15th century Italy, was the first and perhaps most important event of Leonardo's life. Because here's what happens when you're shut out from the beginning. When every door is closed before you even approach it. When the world tells you that your mind doesn't matter because your blood isn't pure enough, you stop looking at doors. You stop believing that the paths others walk are the only paths that exist. You become feral in your curiosity, undomesticated. You look at the world itself as the only teacher that will accept you. And Leonardo looked at everything. As a small boy, he would disappear for hours into the countryside around Vinci. While other children played in the streets or helped in their father's workshops, Leonardo wandered the hills alone. He watched water flowing over rocks, mesmerized by the patterns it created, the way it carved channels through stone over time, the spiral movements it made around obstacles. He caught insects and studied them with an intensity that disturbed his family. He would lie on his back in fields for entire afternoons, staring at clouds, tracking their movements, trying to understand what made them form and dissolve. He drew constantly on any surface he could find. The margins of his father's papers, scraps of parchment, dirt floors. He was looking for something. Not just information, not just entertainment. He was looking for the hidden architecture of reality itself. The rules underneath the chaos. The patterns that connected everything. No one taught him this. No scholar sat him down and explained the scientific method, because the scientific method didn't exist yet. No philosopher guided his thinking. What Leonardo had was necessity. When the institutions of knowledge reject you, you build your own institution. When you can't read Latin, you read nature. When you have no teachers, you become your own teacher. And the lessons you learn that way, through direct observation, through failure and experimentation and stubborn, relentless attention, those lessons go deeper than anything a book could teach. But poverty in the 15th century wasn't just about lacking money. It was about lacking everything. Leonardo grew up in a house where he was fed and sheltered but never secure. He watched his father have more children with his legitimate wife, children who would inherit everything while he inherited nothing. He heard the whispers, bastardo, the word that followed him everywhere. He understood, with a child's brutal clarity, that the world had decided his value before he had a chance to prove it. And this creates a specific kind of hunger. Not just for food, though there were times when food was scarce, but hunger for validation, for proof that your mind matters, for evidence that you can create value in a world that insists you have none. This hunger would drive Leonardo for his entire life. It would make him compulsive, obsessive, unable to stop working because stopping meant facing the voice that said he was worthless. It would make him take commissions he couldn't finish because he needed the money but also needed perfection. It would make him brilliant and miserable in equal measure. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The boy is still in Vinci, still wandering the hills, still drawing in the dirt. Still nobody. What separates Leonardo from every other poor, illegitimate child in Renaissance Italy? Because there were thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Children born to the wrong parents in the wrong circumstances, with minds just as potentially brilliant, who lived and died without ever escaping their circumstances. What was different about this particular boy? The answer is uncomfortable. It's not just that he was smarter, though he was. It's not just that he worked harder, though he did. It's that he was observed. By accident, by luck, by the random chaos of a father who, despite his shame about his bastard son, recognized something in the child's drawings that was undeniable. Piero da Vinci was a notary, which meant he worked with merchants, with guilds, with artists. He saw art every day in Florence, where his business took him constantly. He knew what skill looked like. And when he looked at the drawings his illegitimate son made, drawings done with no training, no education, just raw observation and an instinct for capturing life on paper, he saw something that terrified and excited him. This boy could draw like someone who had trained for years. And in 15th century Italy, if you could draw, you had value. You had a path. Not to respectability maybe, not to the university or the church, but to craft, to workshop, to the possibility of earning your own living. When Leonardo was 13 or 14 years old, his father made a decision that would change everything. He gathered some of his son's drawings, works that showed birds in flight, plants with their leaves precisely rendered, human faces captured with unsettling realism. He took them to Florence, to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most successful artists in the city. And he asked if his son could be apprenticed there. We don't know exactly what Verrocchio saw in those drawings. We don't have them anymore, they're lost to history. But we know what happened next. Verrocchio, a man who trained artists like he trained soldiers, harsh and demanding and brilliant, looked at the work of an uneducated bastard from a village no one had heard of, and he said yes. Leonardo left Vinci in the early 1460s and moved to Florence. He was a teenager, awkward, strange, still poor, still illegitimate, still marked by the shame of his birth. But he was walking into the most explosive period of human creativity the West had ever seen. He was walking into the heart of the Renaissance. And he was walking in Hungary. Florence in the 1460s was not the marble museum it is now. It was alive, chaotic, violent, beautiful. A city of maybe 60,000 people crammed inside medieval walls, with towers rising up from the houses of competing families like swords pointed at heaven. The Medici family had just consolidated their power, turning what had been a banking dynasty into something closer to a royal court. Money flowed through the city like the Arno River that split it in half. Wool merchants, silk traders, bankers who financed wars across Europe. And with money came art. Because art in Renaissance Florence wasn't decoration. It was propaganda. It was power made visible. The wealthy families competed to commission the most beautiful chapels, the most lifelike sculptures, the most impressive paintings. The guilds competed to fund the most elaborate public works. The church competed with everyone. And all of this competition created an ecosystem where artists could actually make a living. Not a comfortable living necessarily, but a living. The workshops were the engine of this creativity. Botteg they were called. Half school, half business, half madhouse. A master artist would take in apprentices, boys mostly as young as 10 or 12, and teach them everything. How to grind pigments from minerals and plants. How to prepare panels with layers of gesso until they were smooth as skin. How to mix egg tempera so the colors wouldn't crack. How to draw from life. How to sculpt in clay and cast in bronze. How to understand perspective, geometry, anatomy, light. And in exchange, the apprentices worked. They prepared materials. They painted background details in the master's compositions. They built frames. They ran errands. They lived in the workshop, slept there, ate there, breathed the smell of linseed oil and turpentine until it became part of their bodies. Verrocchio's workshop was one of the best. He wasn't the most famous artist in Florence. That title belonged to men like Donatello or Ghiberti. But Verrocchio was successful, reliable, and innovative. He could paint, sculpt, work in bronze, design architecture. He taught his apprentices to think like engineers as well as artists. Form followed function in his mind. Beauty emerged from understanding how things actually worked. He dissected the visual world with the same cold precision he used to dissect a business contract. And into this workshop walked Leonardo, the illegitimate boy from nowhere, carrying his poverty like a second skin. The other apprentices would have seen him immediately for what he was. No money for fine clothes. No family connections to boast about. No Latin education. Some of them came from respectable families, younger sons who needed a trade. They would have mocked him. Bastardo di Vinci. The insult was always there, lurking under every interaction. In a world where your name determined your worth, having the wrong name made you a target. But Leonardo had one defense. He could draw better than all of them. There's a story, probably apocryphal but repeated enough times to have weight, about Leonardo's first major contribution to Verrocchio's workshop. The master was working on a painting of the Baptism of Christ, a large commission for a church. He assigned different parts of the composition to different apprentices, as was standard practice. Leonardo was given one of the angels in the corner. Just a supporting figure. Nothing important. A test, maybe, to see what this strange new apprentice could do. Leonardo painted his angel with such breathtaking realism, with such subtle modeling of light and shadow, with such careful attention to the fabric of its garment and the softness of its hair, that it made everything else in the painting look dead by comparison. The story goes that Verrocchio, seeing what his apprentice had done, put down his brushes and never painted again. That's not true. We have later paintings by Verrocchio. But the emotional truth of the story is real. The master had recognized that the student had already surpassed him in one crucial aspect: the ability to make paint look like life. Leonardo didn't just copy what he saw. He saw what others couldn't. He noticed the way light doesn't hit skin uniformly, how there are always subtle gradations, how flesh and shadow isn't just darker but takes on different hues. He noticed how hair doesn't sit in perfect curls but has weight and randomness. He noticed that eyes aren't just wet spheres but complex structures with depth and transparency. And somehow, without anyone teaching him, he figured out how to translate these observations into paint. This should have been his moment of triumph. The poor boy proving his worth. But here's the thing about being brilliant when you're supposed to be nothing. It doesn't make people love you. It makes them fear you. The other apprentices saw Leonardo's talent and it confirmed their worst suspicions. He was unnatural. Too good too fast. There was something wrong about him. He didn't make friends easily. He was too internal, too obsessed with his own thoughts. He would spend hours staring at a piece of drapery, studying how fabric folded, while the others joked and gossiped and bonded. He made them uncomfortable. And Leonardo felt this isolation like a knife. He wanted to belong. Every human wants to belong. But he couldn't fake being less than he was. He couldn't make his mind smaller to fit into their world. So he withdrew further into his work, into observation, into the endless, compulsive study of everything around him. He began to go to the markets and watch people. Really watch them. He would follow interesting faces through the streets, memorizing the way their expressions changed, the geometry of their features, the way emotion translated into muscle movement. He sketched constantly. Quick studies on scraps of paper. Grotesque faces, beautiful faces, old faces, young faces. He was building a library in his mind of human variation. He was teaching himself what a human being actually looked like, not the idealized version from classical statues, but the real, messy, asymmetrical truth. He went to the hospitals and watched the sick and dying. This was forbidden, technically. The church controlled access to bodies and taught that the human form was sacred, not to be examined too closely. But Leonardo was developing a philosophy that would define his entire life. The truth was more sacred than tradition. Reality was more important than orthodoxy. If you wanted to paint humans convincingly, you had to understand how humans were built. Skin and muscle and bone. The architecture underneath. So he snuck into places he wasn't supposed to be. He bribed grave diggers for access to corpses. He dissected in secret, by candlelight, cutting into flesh that was beginning to rot, breathing through his mouth to avoid the smell, his hands steady as he peeled back layers of tissue to reveal the machinery beneath. Heart and lungs and intestines. The branching rivers of blood vessels. The pale cords of nerves. He drew everything. Thousands of sketches, done with a precision that wouldn't be matched by medical illustrators for centuries. This wasn't just about art anymore. This was about understanding existence itself. How does a body move? What makes a hand grip? How does the eye process light? What is the relationship between the brain and the soul? Leonardo was operating without a framework, without a scientific tradition to guide him, but he was inventing his own methodology. Observation, dissection, drawing as a form of thinking, hypothesis, experimentation. And all of this work, this obsessive accumulation of knowledge, was happening in the margins of his life. Because he was still an apprentice. He still had to work for Verrocchio, fulfilling commissions, making money for the workshop, proving his worth every single day. He was still the bastard from Vinci. Still poor. Still without any guarantee that his talent would be enough to lift him out of poverty permanently. The workshop years were brutal. Apprentices worked long hours for little pay. They lived communally in cramped quarters with no privacy and no escape from each other. Leonardo was in his late teens and early 20s during this period, and we can piece together some of what his life was like from later recollections and legal records. He was tall for the time, maybe 5'8" or 9", which was above average in an age of poor nutrition. He was strong from working with heavy materials. He was beautiful, according to multiple sources, with unusual features and long hair that he kept carefully groomed even when he had no money for decent clothes. And he was lonely. He formed an attachment to a younger apprentice at some point during these years. The nature of this relationship is debated, but what's clear is that Leonardo felt things deeply and expressed those feelings poorly. He wasn't good at human connection. He wanted it desperately, but he didn't know how to maintain it. People found him strange. intense. He would go silent for days, absorbed in some problem, and then suddenly want to talk about the structure of bird wings or the mathematics of water flow. He collected animals and kept them as pets, spending money he didn't have to buy caged birds at the market so he could set them free and watch how they flew. He was vegetarian in an age when meat was status, which marked him as weird and possibly heretical. But he was also developing a reputation. By his mid-20s, Leonardo was no longer just Verrocchio's talented apprentice. He was becoming Leonardo. Wealthy Florentines who wanted portraits or religious paintings were starting to request him specifically. The Medici family noticed him. Lorenzo de' Medici, the most powerful man in Florence, brought Leonardo to his garden to work alongside other young artists, creating an informal academy where they could study classical sculptures and push each other toward greater heights. This should have been the beginning of success, the poor boy breaking through. But Leonardo's poverty had taught him something that would haunt him forever. He had learned not to trust success, because success was always temporary, always fragile. He had watched his father prosper while he starved. He had seen how quickly society could withdraw its approval. So when commissions came, he approached them with a mixture of ambition and terror. He wanted them desperately because they meant validation, money, survival. But he was terrified of them because they meant exposure, judgment, the possibility of failure. And this terror manifested in the strangest way. He couldn't finish things. He would start a painting with incredible energy, blocking in the composition, working out the technical challenges, making preliminary sketches that were themselves masterpieces. But then, as the deadline approached, as the patron began to demand results, Leonardo would slow down. He would become obsessed with details that no one else could see. He would start new experiments with materials or techniques. He would take on other projects. He would disappear for days into his notebooks, sketching machines or anatomical studies that had nothing to do with the commission. This drove his patrons insane. They paid in advance, expecting work within a reasonable time frame, and Leonardo would deliver nothing. Or he would deliver something incomplete. Or he would deliver something so late that the circumstances had changed entirely. He was building a reputation as unreliable even as he was building a reputation as brilliant. And in a world where your livelihood depended on commissions, where artists competed viciously for patronage, being unreliable was dangerous. But here's what was really happening. Leonardo wasn't procrastinating because he was lazy or undisciplined. He was procrastinating because he was cursed with the ability to see everything wrong with what he was creating. Every painting he started was supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to justify his existence, prove that the bastard from Vinci deserved to be here, deserved to be taken seriously. And nothing was ever perfect enough. The gap between the vision in his mind and the reality on the panel was always too wide. So he kept working, kept refining, kept experimenting, trying to close that gap, knowing it was impossible but unable to stop himself. This is the cost of surviving poverty through excellence. You internalize the idea that you are only as valuable as your last achievement. You become addicted to the validation that comes from being extraordinary. But you also become terrified of ordinariness, of being found out as less than you appear. It's a trap that no amount of success can fully escape. And Leonardo was still in Florence, still trying to establish himself, still hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food anymore. He had proven he could paint as well as anyone alive. But painting wasn't enough. His mind was too large, too restless, too unwilling to be confined to a single discipline. He wanted to understand everything. Light, water, anatomy, engineering, mathematics, music, architecture, the human mind, the structure of the cosmos. There was no category of knowledge that didn't fascinate him, no problem that didn't demand his attention. This should have made him a true Renaissance man, the ideal of the period. And in retrospect, that's exactly what he became. But living through it, he was just a poor, illegitimate artist who couldn't finish his commissions and kept filling notebooks with drawings of things that didn't exist yet. To his contemporaries, Leonardo was talented but difficult, brilliant but unreliable. The kind of person you recognized had genius but weren't sure you wanted to work with. He was 30 years old before he left Florence, and by then he had completed maybe 4 paintings. 4 paintings in over 15 years as a professional artist. Most of his peers had completed dozens by that age, building steady careers, earning steady money, establishing steady reputations. But Leonardo had spent those years doing something else. He had spent them learning, observing, experimenting, building a knowledge base so vast that it would eventually explode into the world and change everything. But before that explosion could happen, before Leonardo could become Leonardo, he had to leave home. He had to go to Milan, to the court of a brutal warlord who needed engineers more than he needed artists, and reinvent himself completely. He had to take everything poverty had taught him, every observation he had made while wandering hungry through the streets of Florence, every corpse he had dissected in secret, every machine he had sketched in his notebooks while ignoring his commissions, and offer it all to a man who didn't care about art but desperately needed weapons. The boy from Vinci, the bastard who survived by seeing what others couldn't, was about to become something else entirely. He was about to become necessary. And necessity, Leonardo had learned, was the only currency that mattered in a world that wanted to forget you existed. In 1482, Leonardo da Vinci wrote a letter that would define the rest of his life. He was 30 years old, and Florence had become too small for him. Or maybe he had become too strange for Florence. The city that had nurtured him was also suffocating him. He had talent, yes. Everyone acknowledged that. But talent without social connections, without family money, without the ability to finish what you started, that kind of talent was dangerous. It made you brilliant and broke at the same time. So Leonardo looked north to Milan, where Ludovico Sforza, the de facto ruler of the city, was consolidating power and building an empire. The letter Leonardo wrote to Ludovico is one of the most extraordinary documents in history. Not because of its literary quality, not because of its humility, but because of what it reveals about survival. About a man who had learned, through brutal experience, that you sold yourself based on what people needed, not what you wanted to be. Leonardo didn't introduce himself as an artist. He barely mentioned painting at all. Instead, he presented himself as a military engineer. He wrote, in careful, deliberate prose, that he could design portable bridges for armies to cross rivers quickly, that he could drain moats surrounding enemy fortresses, that he could construct siege weapons, catapults, and bombards that would destroy walls no others could breach, that he could build armored vehicles that could break through enemy lines while protecting the soldiers inside, that he could design cannons, both large and small, that would rain destruction on opposing forces. He listed 10 separate military capabilities, each one described with confidence bordering on arrogance, and only at the very end, almost as an afterthought, did he mention that he could also paint and sculpt as well as any man living. This wasn't dishonesty. Leonardo had actually been designing these machines. They filled his notebooks, page after page of sketches showing bridges that could be assembled rapidly, tanks with moving turrets, multi-barreled guns, even a primitive submarine for underwater warfare. None of them had been built. Most of them couldn't be built with 15th century technology. But they existed in Leonardo's mind as fully realized objects, and he drew them with such precision, such attention to mechanical detail, that they looked real. They looked possible. What Leonardo understood, what poverty had beaten into him, was that beauty alone had no value in a world preparing for war. Art was decoration. Engineering was survival. If you wanted patronage from a man like Ludovico Sforza, a man who had seized power through military force and held it through constant vigilance, you offered him weapons. You offered him advantage. You made yourself necessary. And it worked. Ludovico brought Leonardo to Milan, not as a painter primarily, but as a court engineer and designer. He gave him a salary, a workshop, access to materials and craftsmen. He gave him, for the first time in Leonardo's life, something approaching security. Not wealth. Leonardo was never wealthy. But security. The knowledge that he could eat, that he had a place to work, that he wasn't one failed commission away from destitution. And what did Leonardo do with this security? He painted the most radically realistic human images anyone had ever seen. Because here's the thing about Leonardo and beauty. He didn't pursue it for aesthetic reasons alone. He pursued it as a form of knowledge. As a way of understanding reality at the deepest possible level. When Leonardo looked at a human face, he didn't see an idealized form handed down from classical sculpture. He saw a machine made of muscle and bone, animated by emotion, shaped by experience. He saw flesh as a translucent medium through which light passed and reflected. He saw that the reason human faces looked alive wasn't because of their features, but because of the subtle transitions between those features. The way shadow blended into light without hard edges. The way color shifted depending on depth and blood flow and the ambient environment. He called this technique sfumato, smoke. The idea that nothing in nature has a hard outline, that everything bleeds into everything else through imperceptible gradations. If you wanted to paint something that looked truly alive, you couldn't draw lines around it. You had to build it up through layers of transparent glazes, each one slightly modifying the hue and value beneath, creating depth through accumulated subtlety. It was painting as atmosphere, as breath, as the visible evidence of invisible forces. And it was heresy. The church had spent 1,000 years teaching that the human form was a sacred mystery, that the body was a temple not to be examined too closely, that its beauty came from God and should be represented with dignity and distance. The great religious art of the medieval period showed humans as symbolic figures, stylized and formal, existing in a spiritual realm that was more real than the physical world. Gold backgrounds instead of landscapes. Flat bodies without anatomical accuracy. Expressions of devotion rather than individual personality. Leonardo looked at this tradition and saw cowardice. Saw ignorance masquerading as piety. If humans were made in God's image, then understanding the human body wasn't blasphemy. It was the highest form of worship. Every muscle, every tendon, every fold of skin was evidence of divine engineering. To paint a human being with perfect realism wasn't to diminish the sacred. It was to reveal it. So he dissected. Secretly, mostly because the church still controlled access to corpses and still taught that cutting into the dead was profane. But Leonardo had connections now. Money, at least enough money. He bribed officials at hospitals. He made arrangements with executioners who could deliver the bodies of criminals. He worked at night in locked rooms with assistants who asked no questions. And he cut. The first time you cut into a human chest, you're overwhelmed by the wrongness of it. The resistance of skin tougher than you expect. The layer of yellow fat beneath like tallow. The meat smell that rises when you penetrate deeper, the still warm cavity where life was. The heart, smaller than paintings show it, a fist-sized muscle gone slack and purple. The lungs, deflated bags stained with the soot of city air. The stomach, the liver, the snaking intestines that go on forever when you pull them out. Impossible that all of this fit inside. Impossible that this machinery of flesh was a person hours ago. Leonardo recorded it all. Not with disgust. Not with horror. With reverence. He drew the rib cage from multiple angles, showing how the bones arc to protect the organs beneath. He drew the heart with its chambers and valves, tracing the path blood must take, decades before William Harvey would prove circulation. He drew hands in layers, peeling back skin to show the tendons underneath, then removing those to show the bones, understanding that to draw a hand convincingly in any position, you had to know the structure that determined its movement. He drew the human face with the muscles exposed, noting which ones created which expressions, mapping emotion onto anatomy. He filled thousands of pages with these studies, drawing not just what he saw but what it meant, adding notes in his strange mirror writing, right to left, legible only in a reflection. Some scholars think he wrote this way to keep his work secret, to protect himself from charges of heresy. Others think it was simply natural for him, being left-handed. But there's a third possibility. That mirror writing was a psychological defense. That by reversing his words, Leonardo could maintain distance from his own thoughts, could examine his ideas as if they belonged to someone else, could avoid the full weight of what he was discovering. Because what he was discovering was terrifying. He was discovering that humans were machines. Extraordinarily complex machines, yes, but machines nonetheless. There was no visible soul in the dissected body. No seed of divinity. Just meat and fluid and electrical impulses he couldn't yet name. The brain was just another organ, wrinkled and gray, no different in basic composition from a liver or lung. Where was God in this? Where was the eternal spirit the church promised? Leonardo didn't write about these doubts explicitly. He was too smart for that. But you can see them in his obsessive documentation, in his need to understand every mechanism, as if by mapping the body completely he might find the point where material became spiritual. He never did. And he took all of this knowledge, all of this forbidden anatomical understanding, and he put it into his paintings. Not obviously. He wasn't painting dissected corpses, though he did sketch those too. But when he painted a Madonna holding the infant Christ, he painted the weight of the child correctly. The way the mother's arm muscles would tense to support that weight. The softness of baby flesh, different in texture and color from adult skin. The way fabric draped over a body according to gravity and the structure beneath. He painted these figures so they didn't just look human. They felt human. They had presence. Massachusetts mortality. This was beauty as rebellion. This was Leonardo taking everything the church said about sacred mystery and responding with sacred truth. The truth of observation. The truth of the body. The truth that divinity, if it existed, had to be found in reality, not in denial of it. And people were shocked. The wealthy patrons who commissioned religious paintings from Leonardo expected something elevated. Something that fit within the tradition. What they got was something uncanny. Figures that were too real, too present, too much like actual people standing in actual space. The paintings made viewers uncomfortable even as they couldn't look away. There was something both holy and profane about them. Something that suggested Leonardo had seen too much, understood too much, gone too far. The church noticed. Not immediately but eventually. There were quiet investigations. Questions about where Leonardo acquired bodies. Suggestions that his work was perhaps too focused on the material at the expense of the spiritual. He was never formally charged with anything. He was too valuable, too connected to powerful patrons. But the warning was there. The reminder that knowledge had limits, and exceeding those limits had consequences. Leonardo didn't care. Or rather, he cared desperately but couldn't stop himself. His curiosity was stronger than his fear. His need to understand trumped his need for safety. This is the pattern of his life. The pattern of all great minds cursed with poverty's lessons. You learn that the only thing you can trust is your own ability to see and understand. So you keep seeing. You keep understanding. Even when it isolates you. Even when it makes you strange. Even when it costs you everything. In Milan for a while it seemed like maybe it wouldn't cost everything. Ludovico Sforza was pleased with his new acquisition. Leonardo was designing festivals and pageants, creating mechanical wonders that impressed visiting dignitaries. He was painting. He was teaching apprentices in his workshop. He was making a life. And then Ludovico gave him the commission that would become his first great public heartbreak. The Duke wanted a statue. Not just any statue. The largest equestrian monument ever attempted. A bronze horse, over 20 feet tall, carrying the figure of Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, the condottiere who had founded the family's power. This statue would stand in the center of Milan, visible from everywhere in the city, announcing Sforza greatness to the world. It would be impossible to build. Which is exactly why Ludovico wanted Leonardo to design it. Leonardo saw this commission and saw vindication. Finally, a project worthy of his capabilities. A chance to combine art and engineering on a scale no one had attempted. He threw himself into the work with manic energy. He studied horses. Not the stylized horses of existing equestrian statues, which were usually stiff and anatomically impossible, but real horses. He spent months at the ducal stables, drawing them from every angle, watching how they moved, understanding the architecture of their musculature. He dissected dead horses, mapping their skeletons, noting how weight distributed through their legs, how their necks curved, how their heads balanced. He designed the statue to show the horse rearing, forelegs off the ground, which would make the engineering exponentially more difficult. Bronze is heavy. Unimaginably heavy. A horse that size, cast in bronze, would weigh 75 tons or more. Supporting that weight on just the two back legs and the tail would require internal armoring and perfect balance. The casting itself would be a nightmare. You couldn't cast something that large in one piece. You'd have to cast it in sections and assemble them, which meant every joint had to be perfect. And the amount of bronze required, the cost, the furnaces needed to melt that much metal at once, it was logistically insane. Leonardo loved every impossible aspect of it. He spent years designing the casting process. He created a full-scale clay model, what we'd call a maquette, but 24 feet tall. He had it displayed in the courtyard of the Sforza castle, and people came from across Italy to marvel at it. The clay horse, Illinois Cavallo, was already a masterpiece even before the bronze version existed. The anatomy was perfect. The sense of power and motion captured in static form was breathtaking. This was Leonardo at his best, combining observation, artistic skill, and engineering genius into something no one else could have conceived. And then reality intervened. In 1494, France invaded Italy. Charles VIII brought an army over the Alps and swept through the northern states, and suddenly Ludovico Sforza had a problem much more urgent than a statue. He needed weapons. He needed cannons. And cannons were made of bronze. The same bronze that was supposed to become Il Cavallo. Leonardo watched them melt his horse. Not the clay model, but the 75 tons of bronze that had been gathered for the casting. Watched it go into the furnaces and come out as instruments of war. Years of work. Years of obsessive preparation. The engineering solution he'd devised, the casting process he'd invented, the perfection he'd been chasing. All of it rendered irrelevant by politics and violence. The clay horse stood in the courtyard for a few more years, a ghost of what should have been. Then French troops occupied Milan in 1499, and French archers used Il Cavallo for target practice. They shot arrows into it until it collapsed. The greatest equestrian sculpture never made, destroyed by the same military necessity that had prevented its creation. This is what poverty teaches you about dreams. That they're hostage to forces beyond your control. That no amount of genius protects you from the chaos of the world. That you can do everything right and still fail because someone with more power needs your resources for something else. Leonardo had finally had a project worthy of him, backed by sufficient funding and authority, and it had been taken away not because he couldn't do it, but because war was more important than art. Because destruction was always more urgent than creation. He never fully recovered from this failure. Not emotionally. Il Cavallo haunted him for the rest of his life. He would return to designs for equestrian monuments again and again in his notebooks, trying to solve the problem, trying to prove that it could have worked. But he never got another chance to build one. The moment had passed. The bronze was gone. The dream was dead. And so Leonardo did what survivors do. He reinvented himself. Again. If Ludovico needed an engineer, he'd be an engineer. If the world wanted war, he'd design war. He buried his grief in work and transformed his workshop from an artist's studio into something closer to an arms laboratory. The machines he had sketched in his letter to Ludovico years earlier, the fantasies he'd drawn in notebooks, he now began to develop seriously. Not all of them could be built. Many of them were centuries ahead of available technology. But some of them were possible, and those he pursued with cold determination. He designed an enormous crossbow 50 feet across that could launch projectiles with devastating force. He improved the design of bombards, the massive cannons used in sieges. He invented a multi-barreled gun, what we call a machine gun, with multiple rotating barrels that could maintain continuous fire while others reloaded. He designed fortifications based on mathematical principles, star-shaped walls that would deflect cannonballs rather than absorbing their impact. And he designed tanks. Actual tanks, 400 years before they would appear on the battlefields of World War I. Circular armored vehicles with cannons pointing out in all directions, propelled by men turning cranks inside, protected by slanted metal plates that would deflect projectiles. He drew them in perfect detail, showing the gear mechanisms, the vision slits, the way multiple vehicles could work in formation. They couldn't have worked with 15th century engineering. The power-to-weight ratio was impossible. But the concept was sound. The tactical understanding was sophisticated. Leonardo had invented modern armored warfare in his mind. And he hated it. Every minute of it. Every sketch. Every calculation. Because Leonardo was a pacifist in an age of constant war. He was a vegetarian who refused to eat meat because he believed killing animals was wrong. He bought caged birds at markets just to set them free. He wrote in his notebooks that man has great power of speech, but what he says is mostly vain and false. That man's ingenuity creates wonderful instruments, but uses them for destruction. He saw war as obscene, as the triumph of human stupidity over human potential. But he designed weapons anyway, because he needed to eat, because he needed patronage, because poverty had taught him that principles were a luxury you couldn't afford when survival was at stake. This is the compromise that haunts every brilliant person who grows up with nothing. You learn to do what's necessary even when it violates everything you believe. You learn to put your gifts in service of things you despise because the alternative is invisibility, is irrelevance, is the return to poverty that terrifies you more than moral compromise. There's a note in one of Leonardo's notebooks, written in his mirror script, easy to miss among the technical drawings. It says, "I wish to work miracles. I wish to be remembered. But I do not wish to be remembered for this." The "this" was a design for a ship-destroying weapon, something like a submarine or a diving suit that would let a soldier swim underwater and drill holes in enemy hulls. Leonardo described how it would work in perfect detail. And then he wrote that he would not publish it, would not share it, because men are evil and would use it for mass murder. This from a man who was being paid to invent exactly these kinds of things. The contradiction nearly destroyed him. He suffered from what we might now call depression, long periods where he couldn't work, couldn't create, couldn't find meaning in anything. His notebooks from the Milan period are filled with dark observations about human nature, about the futility of existence, about the stupidity of mankind. But they're also filled with something else, with an almost desperate attempt to find beauty and meaning in pure knowledge. As if by understanding everything about how the world worked, he could transcend the horror of what humans did in that world. This is when the notebooks became his true work. Not the paintings, which he was completing more and more slowly. Not the engineering projects, which disgusted him even as he perfected them. But the notebooks, the endless, obsessive documentation of everything he observed. Leonardo's notebooks are not journals in any conventional sense. They're not organized. They're not written for an audience. They're the raw dump of a mind that couldn't stop processing information. A sketch of a flying machine next to a recipe for paint. An anatomical study next to a shopping list. A proof of a geometric theorem next to a joke about a priest. A design for a canal system next to a drawing of a baby in the womb. They jump between topics with a logic that makes sense only if you understand that for Leonardo, everything was connected. Architecture and anatomy. Engineering and art. Mathematics and nature. There were no separate disciplines in his mind. There was only observation and understanding. The pages are covered in his mirror writing, dense and difficult to read, surrounding drawings of such precision that they still take your breath away 500 years later. He drew water flowing, capturing its spiral movements in ink, understanding fluid dynamics before the physics existed to explain it. He drew plants with every leaf and vein rendered, understanding their growth patterns and symmetry. He drew machines that combined wheels and gears and pulleys in ways that wouldn't be reinvented until the Industrial Revolution. He drew the human fetus in the womb, curled in its amniotic sac, shown in cross-section with the placenta and umbilical cord, the first accurate representation of gestation in Western art. And he wrote, not essays or treatises but notes to himself, questions he needed to answer, observations he needed to record. Note the tongue of the woodpecker. Observe the curve of a whip in motion. Calculate the weight of air. Describe how clouds form. Determine why the sky is blue. Measure the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. Every page was a conversation with reality, Leonardo interrogating the world and recording its answers. He wasn't writing for publication. He wasn't trying to build a career as a scientist, because the modern concept of scientist didn't exist yet. He was writing to survive, to organize his thoughts, to prove to himself that he understood something, anything, in a world that made no sense. Every observation was a small victory over chaos. Every principle he could articulate was evidence that reality had rules, that it wasn't just random violence and suffering. That knowledge mattered even if nothing else did. The notebooks became his immortality long before he knew they would. During his lifetime they were private, scattered. Most people had no idea they existed. But they survived. Scattered across Europe after his death, broken up and sold and lost and found, but enough remained that when scholars finally began to study them seriously in the 19th century, they realized what they had. They had the mind of a genius preserved on paper. Not the finished, polished genius of completed paintings, but the raw, unfiltered genius of thought itself. The questions, the false starts, the leaps of intuition, the grinding work of observation and deduction. In those notebooks, Leonardo invented the helicopter. Literally. He drew a device with a spiral screw that would compress air and lift a vehicle into the sky. It wouldn't have worked with human power, but the principle was correct, and the design is recognizable as a helicopter to anyone who sees it. He invented the parachute, drawing a man hanging from a pyramid-shaped cloth canopy with the note that if the canopy is properly sealed, a man could throw himself from any great height without injury. He invented the diving suit, with a leather-breathing apparatus and weights to control buoyancy. He invented the machine gun, the tank, the odometer, the anemometer, the hygrometer. He designed a mechanical knight, a robot in everything but name that could sit, stand, and move its arms through a system of cables and pulleys. None of these inventions were built in his lifetime. None of them changed the world when he conceived them. But they existed. On paper, in his handwriting, surrounded by his calculations and observations, they existed as proof that one human mind, given enough curiosity and freedom from convention, could see centuries into the future. And yet Leonardo died thinking he had failed. Because the notebooks weren't success in the way he understood success. They weren't finished paintings that patrons praised. They weren't bronze monuments that cities celebrated. They were just his thoughts, private and scattered and incomplete. Evidence of everything he'd started and not finished. Evidence of a mind too large for any single project to contain. This is the tragedy and the glory of genius shaped by poverty. You learn to value only what others validate. You internalize the message that you must prove your worth constantly, must justify your existence through achievement. So even when you're creating something unprecedented, something that will echo through centuries, if it doesn't bring immediate recognition, if it doesn't translate into security and respect, it feels like failure. Leonardo filled thousands of pages with revolutionary insights and looked at them and saw only work he hadn't completed. Ideas he hadn't perfected. Projects he'd abandoned for the next obsession. He was 50 years old and still uncertain if his life had mattered. Still poor, at least by the standards of truly successful artists. Still illegitimate, still the bastard from Vinci even in a court that respected him. Still unable to finish the paintings he started, because finishing meant accepting imperfection and his poverty-trained mind couldn't accept imperfection. Still filling notebooks with observations no one would see, with inventions no one would build, with knowledge that seemed destined to die with him. He didn't know, couldn't know, that those notebooks would survive and would prove to be his greatest gift to humanity. That 500 years later, people would study them and weep at the beauty of his mind. That everything he thought was failure, every abandoned project and incomplete sketch, would become evidence of how high human thought could reach when freed from limitation. That his poverty, his illegitimacy, his exclusion from the normal paths of education and success, had actually liberated him to see things no one else could see. But in Milan, in 1499, as French troops occupied the city and his world collapsed again, Leonardo didn't know any of that. He only knew that Il Cavallo was destroyed, that Ludovico Sforza had fled, that he was unemployed again 50 years old and starting over. That war had taken everything he built again. That survival meant running again. So he gathered his notebooks, the thousands of pages that represented his life's real work, and he ran. Leonardo had always been obsessed with flight. Not as a fantasy. Not as a poetic metaphor for human aspiration. As an engineering problem that could be solved. He had watched birds since childhood, those hours lying in the fields around Vinci, staring at the sky while other children played. He had seen them ride invisible currents of air, adjusting their wing angles with microscopic precision, using forces he could sense but not yet name. He had understood even then that flight wasn't magic. It was mechanics. If he could decode the mechanics, he could replicate them. In Milan, with access to resources and time, He pursued this obsession with religious intensity. He filled entire notebooks with bird studies. Not just drawings, though the drawings are magnificent. Wings spread, wings folded, wings in mid-beat, rendered with such anatomical precision that ornithologists still use them. But also observations. Data. He measured wingspans and body weights. He timed wing beats and calculated ratios. He dissected dead birds, examining the structure of their bones, hollow and light but reinforced at stress points. He studied their feathers, noting how they overlapped, how air passed between them, how they could be individually adjusted. He watched hawks and wrote, "The bird rises when the wings strike downward and backward. It descends when they strike forward. The faster the bird wishes to fly, the more it must draw its wings toward the tail." He watched swallows and wrote, "The swift beating of wings is only necessary at the beginning of flight. Once in motion, the bird uses its wings more to steer than to propel." He watched gulls riding wind and wrote, "When the wind is equal to the movement of the bird can remain motionless without beating its wings." These weren't poetic observations. These were the principles of aerodynamics, discovered through patient observation 300 years before anyone formalized them into physics. And then he tried to build wings for humans. This is the part that breaks your heart. Because Leonardo understood more about flight than anyone alive, and he still got it fundamentally wrong. He believed that if humans could generate enough force with their arms and legs, flapping artificial wings, they could achieve powered flight. He designed elaborate machines where a man would lie horizontal, pumping pedals with his legs and pulling levers with his arms, driving wings that would beat like a bird's. He calculated the force required. He designed the wing structure, using cane frames covered in starched fabric, mimicking bird anatomy. He created harnesses and control systems. And it couldn't work. Not because the design was flawed in its details, but because the fundamental premise was impossible. Humans don't have the power-to-weight ratio. Our muscles, our metabolism, our entire body plan is wrong for powered flight. Birds have huge chest muscles relative to their body weight, metabolisms that burn at furnace heat, hollow bones, air sacs throughout their bodies. We have none of that. A human being, no matter how strong, cannot generate sustained lift through muscle power alone. Leonardo didn't know this. He couldn't know this. The biology wasn't understood yet. So he kept designing, kept calculating, kept believing that if he could just perfect the mechanism, flight would be possible. He tested his designs. Not personally, usually. He wasn't suicidal. But he had assistants, young men who believed in his genius and were willing to risk their lives to prove his theories. There are records, fragmentary and disputed, of attempts made from hillsides near Florence, from towers in Milan. Men strapped into wooden frames, running downhill to gain speed, launching themselves into air that would not hold them. Crashes. Broken bones. One assistant, a man named Zoroastro according to some sources, supposedly shattered his leg testing one of Leonardo's gliders. Did Leonardo feel guilt? The notebooks suggest he did. There are notes about improving safety mechanisms. Sketches of harnesses that would protect the pilot. But there are also notes that suggest something darker. A coldness. A willingness to sacrifice individuals for knowledge. If you wish to achieve flight, you must be willing to accept injury. The bird that first learned to fly fell many times before it succeeded. This from a man who loved birds so much he bought them just to set them free. The contradiction is hard to reconcile until you understand what poverty does to empathy. It teaches you that survival requires sacrifice. That knowledge justifies cost. That the ends of understanding are worth almost any means. Leonardo never achieved manned flight. Never even came close. But he did achieve something else, something he never got credit for during his lifetime. He invented the parachute. He drew a pyramid-shaped canopy, sealed fabric stretched over a wooden frame, with a man hanging below it. And he wrote, "If a man have a tent made of linen of which the apertures have all been stopped up, and it be 12 braccia across and 12 in depth, he will be able to throw himself down from any great height without suffering any injury." 12 braccia is about 23 feet in diameter. The design is sound. Woodwork. In 2000, someone actually built Leonardo's parachute exactly as he drew it and jumped from 10,000 feet. It worked perfectly. But in Leonardo's time, this was just another unbuilt idea. Another sketch in a notebook no one read. He was pursuing flight with an obsession that looked like madness to his contemporaries. Spending time and money on machines that didn't work while painting commissions sat unfinished. He was nearly 50 years old by Renaissance standards, still poor, still chasing dreams that seemed increasingly pathetic to people who had long since settled into realistic lives. The man who wanted to fly had become a joke to some, a tragic figure to others. Brilliant but broken. Obsessed but unsuccessful. What they didn't understand was that Leonardo wasn't trying to succeed in their terms. He was trying to understand. The flight obsession wasn't about building a working airplane. It was about decoding the principles of aerodynamics, about understanding how weight could be defied, about proving that the impossible was just the not yet achieved. Every failed experiment taught him something. Every crashed glider revealed new information about lift and drag and center of gravity. He was doing science before science existed as a formal discipline. He was testing hypotheses through experimentation, recording results, refining theories. The fact that he never achieved powered flight doesn't diminish the value of what he learned. It just means he was working alone, without the accumulated knowledge that later inventors would have, trying to solve a problem that would require centuries of incremental progress. But the flight obsession was connected to something deeper, something that consumed Leonardo even more completely. The human body. If he wanted to build wings for humans, he needed to understand human anatomy at a level no one had attempted before. He needed to know exactly how muscles generated force, how joints pivoted, how weight distributed through the skeleton. And once he started dissecting to answer these questions, he couldn't stop. The body became its own obsession, separate from flight, separate from any practical application. It became the ultimate engineering problem. The most complex machine in existence, and Leonardo needed to understand every component. He had started dissecting in Florence, secretly buying access to corpses through bribes and connections. In Milan, with more resources, he expanded this work exponentially. He dissected at least 30 human bodies over his lifetime, probably more. Men, women, children, the elderly. He worked quickly because bodies rotted fast, especially in summer. No refrigeration. No preservation techniques beyond crude methods involving alcohol and vinegar that barely slowed decay. He had to complete his studies before the smell became unbearable, before the tissues broke down too much to be useful. This meant long nights, working by candlelight, cutting into flesh that was hours or days dead, breathing through his mouth, his hands inside cavities that had held life. The drawings he made from these dissections are among the most important in the history of medical illustration. He drew the human skeleton from every angle, understanding its architecture in 3 dimensions. He drew the muscular system in layers, showing how muscles attached to bones, how they worked in opposing pairs to create movement. He drew the circulatory system, tracing veins and arteries throughout the body, noting their branching patterns. He drew the nervous system, those pale threads that carried sensation and command. He drew organs with a precision that wouldn't be matched until the 19th century. The heart with its 4 chambers. The lungs with their branching bronchi. The digestive system from mouth to anus. The reproductive organs, male and female, shown without shame or romanticization, just careful documentation of structure. And he made discoveries. Real, significant anatomical discoveries that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. He was the first person to correctly describe the structure of the human spine, noting its curves and counting its vertebrae accurately. He was the first to understand that the heart was a muscle, not some mystical seat of the soul, and that it functioned as a pump. He came close to understanding blood circulation, though he never quite grasped the complete picture that William Harvey would prove in 1628. He discovered the cardiovascular system's complexity, noting how blood vessels branched into increasingly smaller tubes. He studied the eye in extraordinary detail, understanding the lens and pupil and retina, though not quite grasping how the image was transmitted to the brain. He dissected a pregnant woman who had died in childbirth and drew the fetus in the womb, showing it curled in its embryonic position, connected by the umbilical cord, surrounded by amniotic fluid. This drawing is so accurate, so tender in its detail, that modern obstetricians look at it with awe. He showed the layers of the uterine wall, the placenta, the position of the baby's limbs. He understood gestation in a way that the church explicitly forbade. Because the church taught that life began at conception, that the fetus was immediately a fully human soul. Leonardo saw that it developed in stages, that it was initially barely distinguishable from an animal embryo, that human form emerged gradually from something more primitive. He didn't write about the theological implications. He was too smart for that. But the drawings suggest he understood them. This work was heresy. Absolutely, undeniably heresy. The church had explicit rules about handling corpses. They were to be buried quickly, with proper rites, the body kept intact because Christians believed in physical resurrection. The dead would rise with their bodies restored at the end of days. Cutting them apart, removing organs, studying them like mechanisms, this violated fundamental doctrine. And Leonardo wasn't just doing it once or twice. He was doing it compulsively, filling thousands of pages with anatomical studies, building a knowledge base that had no sanctioned purpose. He wasn't training to be a physician. Those were licensed professionals who worked within church-approved frameworks. He was an artist, an engineer, someone with no legitimate reason to be elbow-deep in corpses. He knew the danger. There are notes in his anatomical studies that suggest paranoia. References to keeping the work hidden. Warnings to himself to be careful who he showed these drawings to. He used code words sometimes, referred to dissection as examination or observation, as if linguistic camouflage could protect him. He destroyed some pages, we think, when he felt the risk was too great. What survives is remarkable, but it's likely only a fraction of what he produced. And yet he couldn't stop. This is addiction in its way. Not to a substance but to knowledge, to the high of understanding. Every time Leonardo opened a body and found something unexpected, every time he traced a nerve to its conclusion or understood how a joint worked, he got a rush of pure discovery that was better than any external validation. This was truth. Not social truth, not religious truth, but physical, observable, undeniable truth. The body didn't lie. It couldn't lie. It simply existed, with all its mechanisms visible to anyone willing to look. But this pursuit of truth came at a cost. Leonardo's obsession with anatomy deepened his isolation. He was already strange. The vegetarian artist who wouldn't kill animals, who spoke in riddles, who couldn't finish his paintings. Now he was the man who cut up corpses. Rumors spread. Whispered suggestions that he was a necromancer, someone who communed with the dead. That he was searching for the seed of the soul so he could capture it, trap it, use it for unholy purposes. These weren't just ignorant superstitions. In a world where the line between natural philosophy and black magic was genuinely unclear, where alchemy and chemistry were the same word, where people believed in demons and possession and witchcraft, Leonardo's anatomical work looked dangerous. Potentially evil. He withdrew further into himself. Stopped trying to make friends. Stopped trying to explain his work to people who couldn't understand it. He surrounded himself with a small group of assistants, young men who were loyal and incurious, who would help him acquire corpses and grind pigments and keep secrets. But these weren't real relationships. These were transactions. Leonardo paid them, they worked for him, and the distance between master and servant remained absolute. He was lonely. Desperately, crushingly lonely. But he had learned, through decades of rejection and misunderstanding, that connection required conformity, and conformity meant abandoning the work. So he chose the work. This choice defined his moral code. Because Leonardo wasn't amoral. He had very strong ethics, actually. He just had ethics that didn't align with his society's values. He believed that cruelty was the greatest sin. That causing suffering, to humans or animals, was fundamentally wrong. He was vegetarian at a time when meat was status, when not eating meat marked you as poor or strange or both. He wrote in his notebooks, "The time will come when men will look upon the murder of animals as they now look upon the murder of men." This in the 15th century, in a world where animal suffering was completely invisible as a moral concern. He bought caged birds at markets and set them free, spending money he needed for other things just to watch them fly away. He kept cats and horses and treated them with tenderness that contemporaries found bizarre. Why would you care about the feelings of a horse? It was property. A tool. Leonardo saw something else. Saw consciousness, suffering, beings that experienced pain and fear and deserved not to be harmed. And yet he dissected. Cut into dead flesh, human and animal, searching for understanding. The contradiction seems impossible until you realize that Leonardo distinguished between harm and study. The dead couldn't suffer. Their bodies were abandoned shells, useful only as teaching tools. Using them to advance knowledge to potentially reduce suffering in the living, that wasn't cruelty. That was respect. Treating the body as sacred mystery, refusing to study it, letting ignorance persist that caused living people to die from treatable conditions, that was the real cruelty. He extended this logic to his military engineering work, the work he hated but continued doing. He designed weapons because he believed that better weapons would end wars faster. That if one side had overwhelming advantage, conflicts would resolve without prolonged suffering. It's a dubious moral calculus, the kind of logic that weapons designers have used to justify their work throughout history. But Leonardo seemed to genuinely believe it. He wasn't designing weapons for profit or glory. He was designing them because patrons paid him to, and he needed to survive, but he told himself it was in service of ending violence, not perpetuating it. The man was a mass of contradictions. A pacifist who designed tanks. A vegetarian who dissected animals. An artist who couldn't finish paintings. A genius who felt like a failure. Someone who craved human connection but found it almost impossible to maintain. Someone who believed in compassion but pursued knowledge with a ruthlessness that frightened people. These contradictions didn't make him a hypocrite. They made him human. Deeply, painfully human. Someone trying to find meaning in a world that didn't make sense, trying to build a moral framework from first principles because the traditional frameworks had excluded him. His ethics set him apart. Made him even stranger in a brutal age. The 15th century was not gentle. Public executions were entertainment. War was constant. Slavery was normal. Torture was legal. The church burned heretics alive. Children died of preventable diseases. Life was short and cruel, and most people accepted this as God's design. Leonardo looked at this world and couldn't accept it. Couldn't believe that suffering was inevitable or divinely ordained. He thought humans could do better. Should do better. That knowledge could reduce suffering. That beauty could redeem ugliness. That compassion mattered even when it was impractical. This belief, this stubborn insistence that the world could be different, drove everything he did. It was why he studied anatomy, to understand illness so it could be treated. Why he designed canals and irrigation systems, to bring water to dry land to end famine. Why he pursued flight, to give humans new capabilities, to expand what was possible. Even his art, the paintings that consumed years of his life, they were attempts to capture something transcendent. To show humans not as sinful creatures worthy of punishment, but as beautiful, complex, worthy of love. But idealism doesn't pay bills. Compassion doesn't finish commissions. And Leonardo at 50 was still essentially poor. Still scrambling for patronage. Still taking work he didn't want to survive. Which brings us back to Milan, to the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie, to a wall in the refectory, and to the painting that would become both his masterpiece and his curse. The Last Supper. Commissioned by Ludovico Sforza in the early 1490s, meant to honor the Dominican friars who ate in that hall. A traditional subject, painted in refectories all over Italy. Jesus and his disciples at the moment Christ announces that one of them will betray him. Nothing new about the theme. Everything should have been straightforward. Leonardo should have been able to paint it in months, collect his money, move on. It took 3 years. Nearly destroyed himself in the process. And created something that began falling apart before he even finished it. Because Leonardo couldn't paint the Last Supper the way other artists did. He had to reinvent it. Every other Last Supper showed the disciples arranged formally, evenly spaced, calm despite the dramatic moment. Judas obviously separated, marked by his position or a lack of halo, so viewers would know who to condemn. Leonardo looked at that tradition and saw falseness. Saw ritual masquerading as truth. He wanted to paint the psychological reality of the moment. The shock. The confusion. The disciples turning to each other, demanding to know who would do this terrible thing, everyone suspecting everyone else, the social fabric tearing in real time. So he arranged them in groups of 3, clustered together, their body language telling the story. Some leaning forward in protest. Others pulling back in horror. Hands gesturing, faces expressing individual reactions. Anger, fear, denial, guilt. And Judas not separated but right there among them, recoiling from Christ's words, his face in shadow, his hand knocking over a salt cellar, but not obviously marked as the villain until you study the painting closely. This was revolutionary. This was portraying biblical figures as real people having real psychological reactions. This was exactly the kind of thing that made church authorities nervous. Leonardo worked obsessively. He would arrive at the convent at dawn and paint until dark without eating or drinking, so absorbed he forgot his body existed. Other days he would stare at the wall for hours without touching a brush, working out compositions in his mind. The friars complained. They had contracted for a painting, not for an artist who showed up to stare at blank walls. The prior of the convent went to Ludovico Sforza and demanded Leonardo be forced to work faster. Leonardo responded by threatening to use the prior's face as a model for Judas. But the real problem wasn't Leonardo's working process. It was his materials. Traditional frescoes were painted on wet plaster, the pigments binding chemically with the wall as the plaster dried. This technique was durable, frescoes lasted centuries, but it required working quickly, painting each section while the plaster was still wet. You couldn't revise, couldn't layer, couldn't achieve the subtle gradations Leonardo wanted. So he invented a new technique. He sealed the wall with a mixture of gesso and mastic, then painted on top of it using tempera and oil, allowing him to work slowly, to build up layers, to revise endlessly. It was a disaster. The painting started deteriorating almost immediately. The sealed layer didn't bond properly with the stone wall. Moisture from behind seeped through, carrying salts that crystallized on the surface. The pigments began to flake. Within 20 years of completion, the Last Supper was already damaged. Within 50 years, it was barely recognizable. Viewers described it as a ruin. The most ambitious painting Leonardo ever completed, the work that consumed 3 years of his life, and it was rotting while he still lived. This is the ultimate metaphor for Leonardo's entire existence. Immortality built on fragile matter. Genius that couldn't be sustained. He wanted to create something perfect, something that would last forever, so badly that he rejected traditional methods and invented his own. And his invention failed. Not because he was stupid or incompetent, but because he was pushing boundaries that couldn't be pushed with available materials. He was trying to achieve effects that wouldn't be possible until synthetic pigments and acrylic binders were developed centuries later. He was, as always, ahead of his time. And as always, this meant his work was doomed to fail by the standards he set for himself. The Last Supper is still there, on that wall in Milan. It's been restored repeatedly, most recently in a 20-year project that ended in 1999. What you see now is perhaps 20% original paint. The rest is careful reconstruction based on copies made when the painting was less damaged. It's a ghost of what Leonardo painted. A shadow. But even in its ruined state you can see the genius. The composition that balances 13 figures with architectural precision. The perspective that draws your eye to Christ's face. The gestures that create narrative flow across the wall. The moment of psychological crisis captured in static paint. It's still one of the greatest paintings ever made. And it's been dying since the day Leonardo finished it. This was his masterpiece and it broke his heart. Because he knew. While he was painting it he could see it failing. Could see the moisture problems, the flaking, the way his new technique wasn't working. But he couldn't stop. Couldn't go back to traditional fresco. Couldn't accept the limitations. So he pushed forward, creating something revolutionary that was also doomed. Knowing it was doomed. Unable to do anything else. This is what poverty teaches you. That nothing is permanent. That everything you build can be taken away. That even your greatest achievements are temporary. That the world will take your work and destroy it, not through malice necessarily, but through indifference, through time, through the inevitable decay of all material things. Leonardo painted the Last Supper knowing it wouldn't last. knowing that his attempt to transcend the limitations of traditional painting would result in a painting that lasted less time than traditional paintings. And he did it anyway, because the attempt mattered more than the outcome. Because creating something new, even if it failed, was better than safely reproducing what had been done before. The Last Supper was finished around 1498. By 1499, French troops occupied Milan, Ludovico Sforza had fled, and Leonardo's position collapsed again. He was 50 years old. His greatest commission was decomposing on the wall. His bronze horse had been destroyed. His notebooks were filled with thousands of pages of observations and inventions that no one would see. His flight machines had failed. His anatomical work was heretical. He had alienated patrons with his inability to finish projects. He was, by any conventional measure, a failure. And he still had 20 years left to live. 20 years of wandering. Of searching for patronage. Of being overshadowed by younger artists like Michelangelo and Raphael who could finish projects on time, who didn't have his baggage or his obsessions or his fundamental strangeness. 20 years of continuing to fill notebooks that no one read. Of pursuing knowledge that brought no recognition. Of surviving, barely, on the kindness of patrons who recognized his brilliance but found him increasingly difficult to employ. The man who wanted to fly had learned to fall. And he would fall for 2 more decades before he finally hit the ground. In the midst of all his failures, all his unfinished projects and deteriorating masterpieces, Leonardo created something so simple it fits on a single sheet of paper. And it became the most reproduced, most recognized, most misunderstood image he ever made. The Vitruvian Man. A drawing of a male figure with arms and legs extended, inscribed in both a circle and a square, accompanied by notes about human proportions. You've seen it. Everyone has seen it. On posters and t-shirts and coffee mugs, stripped of context, reduced to decoration. But when Leonardo drew it around 1490, he wasn't making art. He was making a manifesto. A declaration about the relationship between humanity and the divine, between the body and the cosmos, between measurement and meaning. The drawing takes its name from Vitruvius, a Roman architect from the 1st century BCE who wrote a treatise on architecture that included observations about human proportions. Vitruvius claimed that the human body, when properly proportioned, could fit perfectly within both a circle and a square, the 2 most fundamental geometric forms. The circle represented the heavens, the divine, the infinite. The square represented the earth, the material, the finite. If the human body could occupy both simultaneously, it meant humans existed at the intersection of divine and earthly realms. We were the bridge between matter and spirit, the measure of all things. This was provocative philosophy dressed as geometry, because the church taught that humans were fallen creatures, marked by original sin, fundamentally separated from God by our physical bodies. The flesh was weakness. The body was temptation. Salvation meant transcending the physical to reach the spiritual. But here was an ancient Roman architect, and now Leonardo, arguing the opposite. That the body itself was divine. That its proportions revealed cosmic order. That human form, properly understood, was the key to understanding everything. Leonardo took Vitruvius's description and tried to make it real. He measured, obsessively as he measured everything. He measured his own body and the bodies of his assistants and models who came through his workshop. He noted that a well-proportioned man's arm span equals his height, that the distance from the hairline to the chin is 1/10 of his height, that the length of the foot is 1/6 of the height, that the distance from the bottom of the chin to the nose is 1/3 of the face, that from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger is 1/4 of the height. He filled pages with these ratios, searching for the underlying mathematics of the human form. And he found something. Not perfection. No human body actually matches these proportions exactly. We're all asymmetrical, irregular, individual. But he found that there was a pattern. A mathematical relationship between parts that recurred often enough to suggest design. Not divine design necessarily. Leonardo was too much of an observer to believe in a God who micromanaged creation. But design nonetheless. The emergent order of natural systems. The way evolution or physics or whatever force shaped living things tended toward certain proportions because those proportions worked. because they were efficient, because they balanced function and form. So he drew his figure. A nude man, genitals visible because hiding them would be dishonest, anatomically correct because Leonardo couldn't draw any other way. Arms and legs in two positions, one with limbs extended horizontally and vertically, touching the edges of a square, the other with limbs spread wider, touching the circumference of a circle. The navel at the center of the circle. The genitals at the center of the square. The human body is both earthly and divine, both finite and infinite, both measured and measurable, both creature and creator. The drawing is beautiful in its precision. The pen strokes are confident. The proportions are perfect, not the proportions of any actual human, but the ideal proportions suggested by mathematics. The figure seems to float in geometrical space, surrounded by Leonardo's mirror-written notes explaining the ratios. It's science and art and philosophy compressed into a single image. It's everything Leonardo believed about knowledge. That truth came from observation. That the universe operated according to principles that could be discovered. That humans weren't separate from nature but were nature, built according to the same rules that governed everything else. That understanding these rules was the path to meaning. But here's what Leonardo probably didn't intend, what makes the Vitruvian Man so powerful 5 centuries later. It's an image of human vulnerability masquerading as human perfection. This figure, perfectly proportioned and geometrically inscribed, is also naked, exposed, alone in white space, reduced to measurements. The drawing celebrates human form while also dissecting it, measuring it, proving it can be quantified. There's something cold about that. Something that suggests humans are mechanisms that can be understood and therefore controlled and therefore diminished. The drawing asks, if we can be measured completely, if our proportions can be mapped and predicted, what space is left for soul? For mystery? For the unmeasurable aspects of being human? Leonardo didn't answer that question. Maybe couldn't answer it. He drew the Vitruvian Man and moved on to other obsessions, probably not realizing he'd created one of the defining images of humanism. The idea that humans, not God, were the center of the universe. That our experience, our reason, our bodies were the starting point for understanding reality. This was Renaissance thinking at its purest. And it was terrifying to the church, even if they didn't fully understand why yet. Because if humans were the measure of all things, what did that make God? Leonardo was walking a dangerous line. He kept attending Mass because not attending was noticed and suspicious. He accepted commissions for religious paintings because that's where the money was. He wrote respectful things about Christianity in his notebooks when he wrote about religion at all. But increasingly, his actual beliefs were somewhere between unorthodox and heretical. He believed in a creator, probably. Something that set the universe in motion. But he didn't believe in a God who answered prayers or performed miracles or cared about human behavior. He believed in natural law, in observable principles, in a cosmos that ran according to rules, not whims. And the human body, with its measurable proportions, was proof that the rules existed and could be known. The Vitruvian Man was drawn around 1490, when Leonardo was in his late 30s, still in Milan, still hopeful that his genius would be recognized and rewarded. By 1499, when Milan fell to the French and his world collapsed again, that hope was fading. He was 50. Old by Renaissance standards, ancient for someone without secure wealth or position. And for the next decade and a half he wandered. Venice briefly. Florence again, though the city had changed and he didn't quite fit anymore. Brief stops in smaller cities where minor nobles offered temporary patronage. He was still Leonardo da Vinci, still famous in art circles, still capable of commanding high fees for commissions. But he was also still unable to finish those commissions, still strange and difficult, still more interested in his notebooks than in making patrons happy. And then in 1513, Leonardo moved to Rome, the eternal city, the center of Christendom, the seat of papal power. Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, had just ascended to the throne of St. Peter, and he was gathering artists to beautify Rome and glorify his reign. This should have been Leonardo's moment. He had connections to the Medici family going back to his youth in Florence. He was the most famous artist of his generation, the man who had painted the Last Supper, whose reputation had somehow survived his inability to produce work. Rome in 1513 was exploding with artistic activity. Money flowed from the papal coffers like wine. Every church needed new frescoes. Every cardinal wanted a portrait. Every public space demanded sculpture. This was the moment when Renaissance art reached its apex, when human creativity seemed capable of rivaling the ancients. But Leonardo arrived in Rome and discovered he was obsolete. Not forgotten. Not disrespected. Just no longer relevant. Because while he had been wandering and filling notebooks and dissecting corpses, a new generation had emerged. Younger artists who had learned from his innovations and pushed past them. Who could finish projects. Who understood how to navigate patronage. Who created work that satisfied both artistic ambition and practical requirements. Michelangelo was there. Buonarroti. 38 years old, 24 years younger than Leonardo, at the absolute peak of his powers. He had just finished the Sistine Chapel ceiling, 4 years of backbreaking work that had produced the most ambitious fresco program in history. Hundreds of figures, scenes from Genesis, the creation of Adam with that iconic almost touching hands reaching toward each other. The work that proved you could combine classical beauty with Christian theology, that you could paint the human form with both power and grace. Michelangelo had succeeded where Leonardo had theorized. Had completed what Leonardo had abandoned. Had proven that genius could be disciplined, that vision could be realized, that obsessive perfectionism didn't have to mean paralysis. And Michelangelo hated Leonardo. Openly. There are records of their encounters in Florence years earlier before Rome. Michelangelo mocking Leonardo for never finishing the bronze horse. Leonardo responding with cutting observations about Michelangelo's crude manners, his lack of education, his obsession with male nudes. It was the hatred of two titans who recognized each other as threats. But it was unequal hatred. Leonardo had to look up at the Sistine ceiling, at work he could never have produced, not because he lacked the skill but because he lacked the ability to commit to a single project that completely. Michelangelo had to look at Leonardo's unfinished masterpieces and incomplete notebooks and feel vindicated in his contempt. Then there was Raffaello Sanzio. 30 years old when Leonardo arrived in Rome, which made him young enough to be Leonardo's son. Beautiful, charming, socially graceful in every way Leonardo wasn't. Raphael could work fast, could manage large workshops full of assistants, could keep patrons happy while producing sublime art. He was painting the stands, the papal apartments, creating scenes of philosophical and theological triumph that combined Leonardo's sfumato techniques with compositional clarity Leonardo never achieved. Raphael had learned from Leonardo, absorbed his innovations in light and shadow and anatomical realism, and then added his own genius for harmony and proportion. He made it look effortless. The younger man revered Leonardo. Sought him out, tried to establish a relationship. But Leonardo must have found this excruciating. Being revered by someone who had surpassed you. Being treated with respect that felt like pity. Raphael was everything Leonardo wasn't. Successful, productive, beloved, able to translate vision into completion. He was what Leonardo might have been if poverty hadn't broken something fundamental in his ability to trust success. So Leonardo, at 57 years old, moved into rooms at the Vatican and tried to find work. The Pope gave him a commission. Of course he did. You didn't bring Leonardo da Vinci to Rome and ignore him. But the commission was minor. A painting, nothing monumental. And Leonardo approached it the way he approached everything, with obsessive preparation and inability to actually paint. He spent months preparing varnishes, experimenting with new materials, making preliminary drawings. The Pope, hearing reports of this, supposedly said in frustration, "Alas, this man will never do anything, for he begins thinking about the end before he starts." That quote, if it's real, cuts to the heart of Leonardo's tragedy. He did think about the end before starting. He saw all the ways a project could fail, all the imperfections in his vision, all the gap between conception and execution. And this foresight, this ability to see problems before they manifested, paralyzed him. It was the curse of intelligence combined with the trauma of poverty. Nothing could be risked unless it was perfect, and nothing could be perfect so nothing could be risked. He continued his other work. The secret work, the notebook filling, the anatomical studies. Rome gave him access to hospitals, to the dead, and he continued dissecting even though it was increasingly dangerous. The church was tightening its control over knowledge, would soon face Luther's challenge and respond with the Counter-Reformation's intellectual crackdown. Leonardo was dissecting at exactly the wrong moment in history. There were investigations, questions about his activities. He had to be careful, had to hide his work more completely than before. And he was lonely. Profoundly lonely in a way that wealth or recognition couldn't fix. He was surrounded by younger artists who respected his reputation but found him strange. He was past his prime in a culture that worshipped youth and virility. He was still illegitimate, still the bastard from Vinci even though no one mentioned it to his face anymore. His closest relationships were with his assistants, young men he employed, and those relationships were transactional, unequal, ultimately unsatisfying. He wanted to be known, truly known, understood not just as a genius but as a human being with fears and doubts and desperate need for connection. But he had built walls too high, had learned too thoroughly that vulnerability meant pain, had retreated too far into his own mind. He walked through Rome and saw his obsolescence everywhere. In the crowds that gathered around Raphael's latest unveiling, in the awe that greeted Michelangelo's work, in the steady stream of commissions that went to younger, more reliable artists. He was still Leonardo, still technically brilliant, still capable of innovations others couldn't conceive. But the world had moved on. His moment had passed. The Renaissance he had helped create was now being perfected by people who had learned from him and left him behind. There are notes from this period that reveal his state of mind. They're fragmentary, scattered among technical drawings and observations, easy to miss unless you're looking for them. Tell me if anything at all was done. Tell me if I ever did a thing. The desperate need for validation. For proof that his life had mattered. For someone to confirm that the decades of work, the thousands of pages of observations, the paintings he couldn't finish and the inventions he couldn't build, that all of it added up to something beyond failure. He was designing machines still. His notebooks from the Rome period include plans for a device to manufacture concave mirrors, for improved locks for canals, for a mechanical sawmill. Always practical problems, always solved with ingenious mechanisms. But none of them were being built. Patrons wanted art, not engineering. They wanted Madonnas and frescoes and portraits, not mechanical innovations. And Leonardo couldn't give them what they wanted because he couldn't stop being what he was. He lasted 3 years in Rome. 3 years of watching younger artists succeed while he filled notebooks. 3 years of minor commissions he couldn't complete while Michelangelo and Raphael painted masterpieces. 3 years of feeling the world's indifference harden into something close to contempt. And then, in 1516, salvation arrived from an unexpected source. France. The country that had destroyed his bronze horse, that had driven him from Milan, sent an invitation. King Francis I, newly crowned at 21 years old, was building a Renaissance court in the Loire Valley. He wanted artists, scholars, philosophers. He wanted to prove that France could match Italy in culture and sophistication. And he wanted Leonardo da Vinci, the most famous artist in the world, even if that artist was 64 years old and hadn't completed a major work in years. Leonardo accepted. Not enthusiastically. At 64, the journey over the Alps would be brutal. He was old, his health failing, his body bearing the accumulated damage of decades of poverty and overwork. But what choice did he have? Stay in Rome and watch his irrelevance deepen? Return to Florence where nothing awaited him? Or go to France, where a young king offered respect, security, and the freedom to work without the pressure of completing specific commissions? Where he could spend his final years as he wished, filling notebooks, pursuing obsessions, being Leonardo without having to constantly justify his existence. So he packed his belongings. His clothes, few and worn. His tools. His materials. And his notebooks. The thousands of pages that represented his life's real work. He couldn't take them all. There were too many and he'd scattered them across Italy, left stacks with friends and former assistants. Sold some when he needed money. But he took the most important ones. The anatomical studies. The machine designs. The observations about water and light and flight. The accumulated knowledge that no one had seen, that no one valued, but that he knew somehow mattered. That had to matter. Because if those notebooks didn't matter, if all those decades of observation and thought and relentless curiosity had produced nothing but private scribblings, then what had his life been for? He also packed 3 paintings. Unfinished, of course. Always unfinished. The Mona Lisa, that portrait of a merchant's wife that he'd been working on for over a decade, that he kept refining even though the commission had long since expired. St. John the Baptist, showing the saint emerging from darkness with an enigmatic smile. And a painting of the Virgin Mary with Saint Anne and the infant Christ, another religious commission he couldn't quite complete. These paintings were his most recent work, the culmination of everything he'd learned about sfumato and light and the rendering of human psychology through subtle expression. They were also evidence of his inability to let go. Normal artists finished paintings and moved on. Leonardo carried his paintings with him like burdens, like children he couldn't release into the world because they weren't yet perfect and never would be. The journey to France took months. Leonardo traveled with his assistant Francesco Melzi, one of the few people he trusted, a young man from a noble family who had chosen to serve Leonardo rather than pursue his own ambitions. They crossed the Alps in winter, an old man and his assistant, carrying notebooks and unfinished paintings, heading into exile. Because that's what it was. Not adventure. Not opportunity. Exile. Voluntary but exile nonetheless. The acknowledgement that Italy, the land of his birth, the cradle of the Renaissance he had helped create, had no place for him anymore. Francis I gave Leonardo a manor house. Château du Clos-Luce in Amboise, a beautiful property near the king's own residence, with gardens and rooms enough for a workshop and staff. The king gave him a generous pension. 400 écus a year, which was real money, enough to live comfortably, enough to finally stop worrying about basic survival. And most importantly, Francis gave him freedom. No required commissions. No deadlines. No expectations except that Leonardo be himself. The king visited regularly, enjoyed conversations about art and engineering and philosophy, treated Leonardo not as a servant but as a treasure. A living legend to be preserved and displayed and learned from. This should have been paradise. After decades of poverty and struggle and patronage that always came with strings attached, Leonardo finally had security without conditions. He could work on whatever he wanted. Could fill notebooks without guilt. Could pursue his obsessions without someone demanding completion. He was 64 years old and finally safe. But safety came too late. His body was failing. He had suffered a stroke, probably in Rome or during the journey to France. His right hand was partially paralyzed. For a left-handed artist, this shouldn't have been devastating, but Leonardo had trained himself to be ambidextrous over the years, and the paralysis affected his coordination generally. He could still draw, but it was harder. The precise lines that had come so effortlessly for 50 years now required concentration and effort. His hand shook sometimes. He had to stop and rest. The machine of his body, that perfect mechanism he had studied in such detail, was breaking down. He continued working. Of course he did. Work was all he knew. He designed a palace for Francis I, an enormous complex that would have been the greatest architectural achievement of the age. It was never built. He designed a canal system to improve irrigation and transportation in the Loire Valley. Parts of it were eventually constructed, but not in his lifetime. He continued refining the Mona Lisa, adding layers of glaze so thin they're almost invisible, trying to achieve a depth of luminosity that existed only in his mind. He worked on theatrical productions for the court, designing mechanical lions that could walk and open their chests to reveal flowers. Spectacles. Entertainments. Nothing that would last. Nothing that would prove he hadn't wasted his gifts. And he was haunted by the unfinished. The bronze horse that had been destroyed. The Last Supper that was rotting on the wall. The notebooks scattered across Italy that no one was reading. The inventions that hadn't been built. The anatomical discoveries that contradicted church teaching and couldn't be published. The flight machines that had failed. The paintings he'd been commissioned to create and had abandoned. Every abandoned project was a ghost, and the ghosts were everywhere. Francesco Melzi tried to organize Leonardo's remaining notebooks, to make some sense of the thousands of pages of observations and designs. But it was an impossible task. Leonardo's mind didn't work in categories. Everything connected to everything else. A design for a flying machine would be adjacent to notes on human anatomy, would be next to observations about water flow, would be followed by a mathematical proof. You couldn't separate them without destroying the logic that connected them, and Melzi was intelligent but not Leonardo. No one was Leonardo. The notebooks would remain chaotic, brilliant, and largely inaccessible. King Francis visited regularly. He was genuinely interested, genuinely respectful, genuinely fond of this strange old Italian genius who lived in the manor house and filled notebooks and couldn't finish paintings. The two of them would talk for hours. Leonardo would show the king his drawings, explain his ideas about everything from human flight to the circulation of blood. Francis would listen, fascinated, treating Leonardo as the treasure he was. It was probably the healthiest relationship Leonardo ever had. Based on mutual respect without the power imbalance of traditional patronage. Francis didn't need Leonardo to produce anything. He just valued Leonardo's existence. His mind. His way of seeing the world. But even this couldn't fill the void. Leonardo knew he was dying. Could feel it in his weakening body, in the way his mind sometimes wandered, in the increasing difficulty of simple tasks. And he knew that he was dying without having proven himself. Without having completed the great work that would justify his existence. The paintings were unfinished. The inventions were unbuilt. The knowledge was unpublished. Everything he had worked for, all the decades of observation and thought and relentless pursuit of understanding, it was all contained in notebooks that no one would read, in paintings he couldn't complete, in a mind that would soon stop existing. On April 23, 1519, Leonardo wrote his will. He was 67 years old. The will is remarkably simple. He left his notebooks to Francesco Melzi, trusting that the young man would preserve them. He left small bequests to servants and friends. He arranged for his funeral, requesting that 60 poor men carry candles in the procession, that masses be said for his soul at multiple churches. This from a man whose beliefs in institutional religion were dubious at best. But even Leonardo at the end reached for the rituals. Hoped that maybe the church was right after all. That maybe there was something beyond death. That maybe his soul would be judged mercifully. He died on May 2, 1519. The legend says he died in King Francis I's arms, the king having rushed to the manor house when he heard Leonardo was failing. The story is probably false. Court records suggest Francis was elsewhere at the time. But the legend persists because it's emotionally true. It captures what should have happened. That Leonardo, after a lifetime of rejection and struggle and loneliness, died held by someone who valued him. That his last moments were tender rather than terrifying. That he wasn't alone at the end. The reality was probably less romantic. He died in his bed, attended by Melzi and perhaps some servants. His body worn out. His mind finally quiet. The compulsive need to understand everything finally satisfied by the ultimate mystery. Whatever last thoughts passed through that extraordinary brain, they died with him. His final observations weren't recorded. They buried him in the chapel of Saint Hubert at the Château d'Amboise. The grave marker identified him as Leonardo da Vinci, a man of great renown. Not the greatest artist of his age. Not genius. Just a man of renown. As if they weren't quite sure what else to say about someone who had been so many things and finished so few of them. His death barely registered in Italy. A few people noted it. Fellow artists mentioned it in letters. But there was no great outpouring of grief. No sense that the world had lost someone irreplaceable. Because Leonardo's reputation was complicated. Yes, he was famous. Yes, his paintings were considered extraordinary. But he was also known as difficult, unproductive, strange. Someone who had promised more than he delivered. Whose talent had been undeniable but whose output had been minimal. Who had spent his life chasing obsessions that most people didn't understand. Michelangelo outlived him by 45 years. Raphael had died the year before Leonardo at only 37, and his death had been mourned across Europe. But Leonardo's death felt almost anticlimactic. The end of a long fade rather than a dramatic finale. An old man dying in exile, leaving behind some famous paintings, some scattered notebooks, and a lot of unfinished business. Francesco Melzi inherited those notebooks and tried to fulfill Leonardo's implicit trust. He sorted through them, attempted to organize them, wrote to other students and assistants trying to collect the pages Leonardo had left elsewhere. He spent years on this project, understanding that the notebooks were important even if he couldn't fully grasp their significance. But when Melzi died 30 years later, the notebooks were dispersed. His heirs didn't understand what they had. They sold pages to collectors. Let some be lost or destroyed. The notebooks were scattered across Europe, ending up in royal collections, libraries, private hands. Most of them remained unread for centuries. The paintings fared better. The Mona Lisa, still unfinished by Leonardo's standards, was eventually purchased by Francis I and became part of the French royal collection. It would hang in the Louvre centuries later, becoming the most famous painting in the world, though not during Leonardo's lifetime. The Last Supper continued to deteriorate on that wall in Milan, but copies had been made, and people still traveled to see it despite its condition. His other works were scattered, some finished by assistants, some left incomplete, all of them attributed to Leonardo even when the connection was uncertain. And for about 300 years that's where things stood. Leonardo da Vinci was a name people knew. A famous Renaissance artist. Important certainly, but not singular. Not the towering figure he would become. He was one genius among many in an age that had produced many geniuses. His inability to complete projects was remembered as a character flaw. His notebooks were curiosities. His life was seen as a cautionary tale. What happens when talent isn't disciplined, when intelligence isn't harnessed to productivity? The man himself was gone. Buried in a chapel that would later be destroyed during the French Revolution. His bones lost forever. Everything material that had been Leonardo, the body he had understood so completely, the hands that had drawn with such precision, the brain that had contained such extraordinary complexity, all of it returned to dust. As if he had never existed. But something survived. Not his body. Not his completed works, most of which were rotting or scattered. What survived was the mind. Preserved in those scattered notebooks. Waiting to be discovered. Waiting for the world to catch up to Leonardo's way of thinking. Waiting for a future that could recognize what the past had missed. The death of the man was complete. The birth of the myth was about to begin. For nearly 3 centuries, Leonardo da Vinci existed in cultural memory as a footnote. A talented Renaissance artist who couldn't finish his work. Someone who had painted that famous Last Supper that was falling apart in Milan. Someone whose name came up in discussions of Renaissance art, always slightly eclipsed by Michelangelo's raw power or Raphael's graceful perfection. His notebooks, those thousands of pages that contained his actual genius, were scattered across Europe like seeds that hadn't found soil. Some were in the royal collection in Windsor, England. Others in Milan's Biblioteca Ambrosiana. More in Paris, in Madrid, in private collections owned by people who had inherited them without understanding what they possessed. The pages were studied occasionally by scholars, but they were difficult to read. The mirror writing, the chaotic organization, the mixture of Italian and Latin, the technical drawings that seemed to depict impossible machines. Most people who encountered them filed them away as curiosities. Interesting but not important. The work of a clever man who had lived in an age of clever men. But something was changing in the world. The 18th century gave way to the 19th, and humanity began to dream in metal and steam. The Industrial Revolution transformed society faster than any period since the Renaissance. Machines became central to human life. Engineers became the new architects of reality. And suddenly, people who understood machines began to look at Leonardo's notebooks differently. They saw sketches that seemed to anticipate modern inventions. Designs that shouldn't have been possible in the 15th century. Evidence that someone, 400 years earlier, had imagined the mechanical future before it arrived. The rediscovery began slowly. In 1797, Napoleon's troops occupied Milan and seized the notebooks housed there, bringing them to Paris. French scholars began to study them seriously for the first time. They found Leonardo's designs for canals and locks, many of which were similar to systems being built across France. They found his studies of hydraulics, his understanding of water pressure and flow, principles that were only now being formalized into engineering science. They began to realize that Leonardo hadn't just been drawing fantasies. He had been doing engineering research 3 centuries ahead of his time. In 1881, a historian named Charles Ravaisin-Malien published a comprehensive collection of Leonardo's manuscripts from the French collections. The work was meticulous, organizing the scattered notes, translating them, making them accessible to scholars who didn't read Italian. And as these scholars read, they began to see patterns. Leonardo hadn't been dabbling in multiple disciplines randomly. He had been pursuing a unified vision of how the world worked, using art and engineering and anatomy and mathematics as different lenses for examining the same underlying reality. He had been doing what would later be called systems thinking, understanding that everything connected to everything else, that you couldn't separate art from science, form from function, beauty from truth. And then they found the machines, the impossible machines. In a notebook that had been sitting in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan for centuries, scholars found a drawing that made them stop breathing. It showed an aerial screw, a spiral blade attached to a vertical shaft, with notes explaining that if the screw rotated fast enough, it would compress the air beneath it and lift a vehicle into the sky. The drawing was dated to the 1480s. Leonardo had invented the helicopter. Not built it. The materials and power sources didn't exist to make it functional. But he had understood the principle. Rotary lift through airfoil compression. The fundamental concept behind every helicopter that would fly 400 years later. They found his designs for the ornithopter, the flying machine with flapping wings. It wouldn't have worked, couldn't have worked, because Leonardo didn't understand the power-to-weight ratio problem. But the mechanical thinking was sound. The understanding of how wings generated lift through air pressure differentials, the control systems for steering, the attention to weight distribution, all of it was correct. Leonardo had failed to achieve flight, but he had mapped the path that others would follow. In another notebook they found the parachute. The sealed pyramid canopy with a man hanging below it, accompanied by Leonardo's note that it would allow someone to jump from any height without injury. In 1783, Louis Sebastian Lenormand had jumped from a tower in France using a rigid frame parachute and become famous as the inventor of the parachute. But Leonardo had drawn the exact same device 300 years earlier, had understood the physics, had calculated the necessary size, had gotten everything right except the fame, because his design had remained hidden in an unread notebook. They found the tank. Multiple drawings of armored vehicles, circular and polygonal, with cannons protruding from all sides, with slanted armor to deflect projectiles, with internal gear systems to provide propulsion. The drawings showed vehicles that could carry 8 men, protected by metal shells, moving under their own power. These were tanks. Actual tanks, conceived in the 1480s, described with such mechanical precision that engineers in the 1890s looked at them and realized they could build them with contemporary technology. Leonardo's tanks would have worked if he'd had engines. He understood armor. He understood firing angles. He understood combined arms tactics. He had invented armored warfare 4 centuries before it changed the face of modern combat. The diving suit, the submarine, the multi-barreled gun. The designs kept emerging from the notebooks, each one more impossible than the last. Leonardo had drawn a suit that would allow a man to breathe underwater, using a leather breathing apparatus connected to the surface. He had designed a vessel that could travel beneath the water's surface, with ballast tanks for controlling depth, with a conning tower for observation, with weapons for destroying enemy ships. He had invented the submarine in concept if not in practice. And the multi-barreled gun, what we would call a machine gun or an organ gun, with multiple barrels arranged in banks, rotating so that one bank could fire while others reloaded, maintaining continuous fire. This was exactly the system that Gatling would invent and patent in 1861, making him famous as the father of the machine gun. But Leonardo had drawn it first, had understood the principle first, had solved the problem of continuous fire first. The scholars who discovered these designs were stunned. Some doubted their authenticity. How could one man working in the 15th century have anticipated so many modern inventions? It seemed impossible. There had to be fraud or later additions or misattribution. But the paper was old. The ink was consistent with the period. The mirror writing matched Leonardo's established hand. And the designs themselves, when analyzed carefully, used mechanical principles and materials available in the 15th century. Leonardo wasn't drawing science fiction. He was drawing engineering solutions to real problems, using the technology of his era pushed to its absolute limits and sometimes beyond them. He was showing what would be possible when better materials and power sources became available. He was thinking like a modern engineer 300 years before modern engineering existed. By the late 19th century, Leonardo's reputation had transformed. He was no longer just a Renaissance artist. He was a prophet, a visionary who had seen the future. Museums began to build models based on his designs, constructing the machines he had only drawn. The helicopter, the parachute, the tank, they built them all and they worked at least in principle. The Italian government commissioned full-scale models of Leonardo's inventions for exhibitions. People came from across Europe to marvel at these machines, to see physical proof that one man's mind had contained the seeds of the modern world. But here's what the celebrations missed. Here's what got lost in the excitement of discovery. Leonardo had drawn these machines because he needed money, because patrons paid for weapons, because poverty had taught him to make himself useful in whatever way kept him alive. The helicopter and parachute were dreams, yes, but the tank? The submarine? The multi-barreled gun? Those were weapons of war, designed to kill efficiently, to destroy enemies, to give military advantage to whoever could build them. And Leonardo had hated creating them. His notebooks made that clear to anyone who read carefully. He had drawn weapons while writing that war was a most beastly madness. He had invented devices for mass destruction while noting that humans were barely evolved from animals, that violence was our default state, that he didn't want to be remembered for these inventions because men would use them for evil. And he was right. Because when the world finally caught up to Leonardo's designs, when we finally had the materials and power sources and manufacturing capabilities to build his inventions, we built them for war. The helicopter's first major application was military, observation and attack. The tank defined modern warfare, first appearing in World War I, where it crushed men in trenches and broke the stalemate of static defense. The submarine became the most feared weapon in naval warfare, silent killer stalking beneath the waves. The machine gun killed millions, changed combat from something that required close proximity to something that could mow down hundreds from a distance. Industrial slaughter, death made efficient. Leonardo had seen this future and had tried to warn against it. But his warnings were in notebooks no one read. And when the notebooks were finally read, people were so excited by his genius that they missed his horror. We celebrated the inventions and ignored the inventor's anguish. We built his weapons and forgot his pacifism. We proved, in the most brutal way possible, that Leonardo had understood human nature correctly. That we were beasts who wrapped our violence in the language of progress. That we would take any tool and transform it into a weapon. That knowledge without wisdom was just a sharper knife. The 19th century's rediscovery of Leonardo coincided with humanity's most destructive period. The same decades that celebrated Leonardo's genius saw the development of dynamite, the Maxim gun, poison gas, aerial bombardment, nuclear weapons. Every advance in understanding was immediately weaponized. Every innovation was turned toward more efficient killing. And all of this accelerating destruction, could trace conceptual lineage back to Leonardo's notebooks. Not directly, he didn't inspire these specific weapons. But he had established the pattern. The fusion of scientific understanding with engineering application. The idea that if you could imagine something, you could build it. That there were no limits to what human ingenuity could achieve. This was Leonardo's true legacy, and it was written in blood. But there was another side to the rediscovery. A quieter, more hopeful side. Because Leonardo's notebooks also showed something else. They showed what a human mind could achieve when freed from conventional thinking. When not constrained by disciplines or categories or the expectation that you should only pursue one type of knowledge. Leonardo had been an artist and an engineer and an anatomist and a mathematician and a philosopher and a musician. and he had been extraordinary at all of them precisely because he refused to separate them. He saw connections that specialists missed. He brought artistic sensibility to engineering problems. He brought engineering rigor to artistic challenges. He proved that the greatest innovations came not from deepening expertise in a narrow field, but from combining knowledge across disciplines. From thinking horizontally instead of vertically. This idea, that creativity emerged from combining unlike things, that genius required breadth as much as depth, that the barriers between art and science were artificial and limiting, this became Leonardo's other legacy. The positive one. The one that inspired rather than destroyed. And as the 20th century progressed, as the world became more specialized and fragmented, Leonardo's example became more important. A reminder that it didn't have to be that way. That one person could still pursue multiple passions. That curiosity didn't have to be constrained by career paths or academic departments. That the most interesting work happened at the intersections between fields. Artists started to reclaim Leonardo. Not just as a historical figure but as a model for how to live creatively. The Surrealists saw him as a precursor, someone who had understood that reality was stranger than convention suggested. Salvador Dali obsessed over Leonardo's paintings, over the sfumato technique, over the way Leonardo could make the familiar seem alien and the impossible seem plausible. Pablo Picasso studied Leonardo's notebooks, particularly the anatomical drawings, using them to understand how to deconstruct and reconstruct the human form. The Cubists and Futurists saw Leonardo's machine drawings as art in themselves, as proof that engineering diagrams could be as beautiful as paintings, that there was no real distinction between technical drawing and creative expression. Scientists claimed him too. Engineers built models of his machines and hung them in their offices as inspiration. Inventors studied his problem-solving methodology, the way he would approach a challenge from multiple angles, sketch dozens of variations, test ideas through drawing before building. His anatomical work was republished and used in medical schools, his drawings accurate enough to still be useful for teaching. His studies of fluid dynamics influenced the development of aerodynamics and hydrodynamics as formal sciences. His observations about light and optics contributed to the development of photography and cinematography. Everywhere you looked in the 20th century, you could find traces of Leonardo's influence. But it was the notebook methodology that perhaps mattered most. The idea that you should record everything. Observe constantly. Sketch compulsively. Question relentlessly. Connect promiscuously. Leonardo had used notebooks as tools for thinking, as external storage for his brain, as laboratories where ideas could collide and mutate and evolve. And as the 20th century progressed, as more people had access to education and materials and leisure time to pursue curiosity, Leonardo's example showed them how. Keep a notebook. Draw what you see. Write what you think. Don't worry about organization or audience. Just capture the flow of your mind. Let ideas accumulate. Trust that patterns will emerge. This sounds simple, almost trivial. But it was revolutionary. Because it democratized genius. It suggested that what made Leonardo extraordinary wasn't some mystical gift, but a practice. A habit. A way of engaging with the world that anyone could learn. You didn't need to be born brilliant. You needed to be born curious and then never stop being curious. You needed to look at things carefully. You needed to ask why and how and what if. You needed to cross-pollinate ideas from different domains. You needed to accept failure as part of learning. You needed to work compulsively, driven by internal curiosity rather than external reward. And people listened. Throughout the 20th century, creators across disciplines adopted Leonardo's methods. Thomas Edison kept notebooks filled with sketches and observations, explicitly modeling his practice on Leonardo's. Albert Einstein, while more formally trained than Leonardo, shared his cross-disciplinary approach, bringing philosophical questions to physics problems, using thought experiments and visual imagination rather than just mathematics. Steve Jobs studied Leonardo obsessively, saw himself as a spiritual descendant, tried to combine art and technology the way Leonardo had combined art and engineering. He famously said that Apple existed at the intersection of technology and liberal arts. that the best products came from marrying design sensibility with engineering capability. That was pure Leonardo. 500 years later, translated into computers and phones, but the same fundamental principle. Elon Musk represents perhaps the closest modern parallel to Leonardo. Not in the specific domains, Musk doesn't paint or sculpt, but in the underlying pattern. Someone who refuses to stay in one lane, who pursues wildly different projects simultaneously. Electric cars and space travel and neural interfaces and tunnel boring. Who brings engineering thinking to problems that most people don't even recognize as problems. Who operates on a timescale that extends beyond his own life, designing solutions for challenges humanity hasn't faced yet. Who is brilliant and difficult and obsessive and often fails but keeps pushing anyway. Who is driven by a vision of what's possible rather than what's profitable. That's Leonardo's pattern. That's what surviving poverty through excellence looks like in the 21st century. The same hunger. The same refusal to accept limitations. The same willingness to look like a failure while pursuing something unprecedented. But there's a cost to this pattern. A cost that we see in Musk, that we saw in Jobs, that we saw most clearly in Leonardo. These men are not happy. They're driven, productive, revolutionary, but not happy. Because the hunger that poverty instills never goes away. The voice that says you're only as good as your last achievement, that says any pause is weakness, that says perfection is the only acceptable standard. That voice doesn't quiet just because you're successful. If anything, it gets louder, more demanding, more impossible to satisfy. Leonardo died thinking he had failed, despite having produced some of the most important work in human history. Jobs died feeling like he had more to do, more to prove, despite having created products that defined an era. Musk will likely die the same way no matter what he accomplishes. Because the pattern, once established, doesn't break. This is the dark truth about genius born from poverty. It's not romantic. It's not inspiring. It's traumatic. It's the transformation of deprivation into compulsion, of exclusion into obsession, of survival necessity into creative drive. And yes, it produces extraordinary work. Yes, it pushes humanity forward. Yes, it gives us art and inventions and ideas that would never exist otherwise. But it does so by consuming the people who generate it, by denying them peace, by making their own extraordinary achievements invisible to them, never quite enough, never quite proof that they deserve to exist. Leonardo's notebooks, those thousands of pages that now inspire millions, that have been digitized and published and studied and celebrated, he looked at them and saw failure, unfinished thoughts, abandoned projects, evidence of his inability to complete anything. The gap between what he had imagined and what he had achieved was all he could see. Not the revolutionary nature of what he had achieved. Not the unprecedented scope of his investigation. Not the fact that he had essentially invented multiple scientific disciplines single-handedly. He saw only what he hadn't done. The bronze horse not cast. The Last Supper rotting. The flight not achieved. The inventions not built. The anatomical discoveries not published. The perfect painting never finished. And maybe that's the most important lesson. Not that we should emulate Leonardo's work habits. Not that we should fill notebooks or pursue multiple disciplines or combine art and science. But that we should recognize the cost of genius shaped by trauma. That we should see the suffering underneath the achievement. That we should question whether this is really the pattern we want to perpetuate. Whether forcing people to justify their existence through constant excellence is the best way to generate human flourishing. Whether poverty and exclusion are really necessary catalysts for creativity, or whether that's just a story we tell ourselves to avoid addressing inequality. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: we don't need another Leonardo. What we need is a world where talented children aren't born into poverty and exclusion. Where illegitimacy doesn't determine opportunity. Where access to education isn't limited by social class. Where people can pursue knowledge without having to constantly prove their worth. Where curiosity is nurtured rather than being the desperate strategy of the excluded. If Leonardo had been born legitimate, wealthy, with access to the best schools and secure patronage, would he have been as creative? Maybe not. But maybe we would have had 10 Leonardos instead of one. 100. 1,000. Maybe genius is rare not because the capacity for it is rare, but because the circumstances that allow it to develop are rare. Leonardo survived brutal poverty to become Leonardo. But how many didn't survive? How many children with equal potential died young, or became laborers, or had their curiosity crushed by the daily grind of survival? How many women, in an age that gave them no access to education or autonomy, had Leonardo's capacity but never got to express it? How many people across history have contained extraordinary potential that never manifested because they never got Leonardo's lucky breaks? The father who recognized his drawing ability, the apprenticeship with Verrocchio, the patronage that barely sustained him. We celebrate the one who made it through. We build monuments to Leonardo's genius. But we should also mourn the countless others we lost. The Leonardos who never happened because the world never gave them a chance. Still, Leonardo's legacy lives. Not just in the machines that were built from his designs. Not just in the artistic techniques that every painter after him absorbed. But in the idea itself. The idea that a human being can choose to understand. Can decide that reality is knowable, that patterns exist, that observation and reason and relentless curiosity can decode the universe. That you don't need permission from authorities or institutions or traditional paths. That knowledge is available to anyone willing to look carefully enough, think deeply enough, work hard enough. That one person, armed with curiosity and a notebook, can change how humanity sees itself. His notebooks continue to inspire. They've been published in every language, digitized, made available online. You can look at them now, sitting wherever you are, and see Leonardo's actual handwriting. His sketches of water spiraling. His anatomical drawings of the human heart. His flying machines and war engines and architectural fantasies. His observations about light and shadow and perspective. His questions about why the sky is blue and how birds fly and what makes waves form. The raw material of his genius, unfiltered, unedited, exactly as it emerged from his mind. And people still study them. Still find inspiration in them. Not just artists or engineers or scientists, but ordinary people who look at Leonardo's example and think, I could do that. Not at his level, obviously. Not with his genius. But I could observe. I could question. I could try to understand. I could keep a notebook. I could draw what I see. I could pursue curiosity wherever it leads. I could refuse to be limited by categories or conventions. I could become, in my own small way, more like Leonardo. More awake to the world. More engaged with reality. More committed to understanding than to comfort. This is his true immortality. Not the paintings, though they're important. Not the inventions, though they're remarkable. But the example. The proof that one human life, lived in service of understanding, in pursuit of truth, driven by relentless curiosity, can echo across centuries. Can inspire millions. Can change, in subtle but profound ways, how humanity thinks about itself. Leonardo showed us what a human mind could achieve. And in doing so he raised the bar for all of us. Made us all a little less satisfied with ignorance. A little more hungry for knowledge. A little more willing to question what we're told and look for ourselves. The Renaissance never truly ended because Leonardo's spirit never died. Every time someone chooses curiosity over comfort, observation over assumption, integration over specialization, they're channeling something of Leonardo's approach. Every time an artist learns engineering or a scientist pursues beauty, they're walking a path Leonardo cleared. Every time someone fills a notebook with observations and sketches and half-formed ideas, trusting that meaning will emerge from accumulation, they're using Leonardo's methodology. Every time we refuse to accept that art and science must be separate, that you must choose one discipline and ignore others, that specialization is the only path to mastery, we're proving Leonardo right. Proving that his way of thinking, born from poverty and exclusion, liberated by necessity, represents something fundamental about human potential. But we have to hold both truths. The inspiration and the cost. The genius and the suffering. The revolutionary work and the traumatic origin. Because if we only celebrate Leonardo without understanding what created him, we risk romanticizing poverty. Treating deprivation as if it's necessary for creativity. Believing that genius requires suffering. And that's a lie. A comfortable lie for societies that don't want to address inequality. But a lie nonetheless. Leonardo didn't need poverty to be creative. Poverty damaged him, limited him, made him anxious and insecure and unable to finish projects, made him spend decades scrambling for patronage instead of freely pursuing knowledge, made him hide his anatomical work instead of publishing it, because he couldn't risk offending the church that controlled his livelihood, made him design weapons he hated because he needed money, made him die thinking he had failed because he never found the external validation that would quiet the internal voice poverty had created. Poverty didn't make Leonardo a genius. It made him a damaged genius. Someone who did extraordinary work despite trauma, not because of it. Imagine what he could have created without that damage. Without the constant anxiety about money. Without the shame of illegitimacy. Without the need to constantly prove his worth. Without the compulsive overwork that left so many projects unfinished. Without the isolation that came from being too strange, too obsessive, too far ahead of his time. We got Leonardo da Vinci, one of the greatest minds in human history, despite the world's best efforts to crush him. But we could have had more. He could have had more. Not more productivity, he produced plenty. But more peace. More joy. More of a life that felt, to him, like it was worth living. So yes, study Leonardo. Learn from his methods. Pursue curiosity relentlessly. Combine disciplines. Observe carefully. Question everything. Fill notebooks. Draw constantly. Think across boundaries. Be multidisciplinary in an age of specialization. All of that is valuable. All of that honors his legacy. But also advocate for a world that doesn't require children to survive poverty to develop their gifts. That doesn't make genius contingent on deprivation. That doesn't treat suffering as a crucible that produces better art. That gives all children, regardless of birth circumstances, the security and education and opportunity to explore their potential. That measures success not by how much you produce but by how fully you live. That values human flourishing over human achievement. That would be Leonardo's true legacy. Not the machines we built from his designs or the techniques we learned from his paintings. But the world we built where the next Leonardo, and all the ones after that, the ones who would have been but never got the chance, could thrive instead of just survive. Could create from abundance rather than deprivation. Could pursue knowledge without terror. Could finish what they started because they weren't paralyzed by the fear of imperfection. Could live long, peaceful lives surrounded by people who loved them, instead of dying in exile, lonely and convinced they had failed. We're not there yet. We're nowhere close. But every time we choose to nurture curiosity in a child regardless of their circumstances, every time we expand access to education, every time we create systems that catch people before poverty crushes them, every time we value human potential over social hierarchy, we move a little closer. We honor Leonardo not by celebrating his suffering but by working to ensure no one else has to suffer that way to become extraordinary. By recognizing that genius is everywhere, potential is universal, and what's rare is opportunity. By building a world where surviving brutal poverty isn't a prerequisite for painting and inventing everything. Where you can just paint and invent, freely, supported, secure. Where your worth isn't contingent on your output. Where being human is enough. That's the world Leonardo never got to live in. But it's the world his life argues for. The world his suffering demanded. The world his legacy should inspire us to build. There's a story, probably invented but emotionally true, about Leonardo's last days in Amboise. They say he stood in his garden looking at the sky, watching birds fly overhead. And someone asked him what he was thinking. And he said, "I have offended God and mankind. My work did not reach the quality it should have." This from a man who had revolutionized painting, invented multiple technologies centuries early, made anatomical discoveries that advanced medicine, filled thousands of pages with observations that would inspire millions. But all he could see was failure. The gap between what he had imagined and what he had achieved. The perfection that had always remained just out of reach. And maybe he was looking at those birds, those creatures he had spent decades studying, that he had tried so hard to emulate, that had always represented freedom to him. Flight as the ultimate human transcendence. The escape from gravity, from limitation, from the earth that held us down. He never flew. Never came close, really. His machines crashed. His apprentices broke bones testing designs that couldn't work. He understood the principles of flight better than anyone alive, but understanding wasn't enough. The materials didn't exist. The power sources didn't exist. The technology didn't exist. He could see the solution in his mind, could draw it perfectly on paper, but couldn't build it in reality. And that gap between vision and execution, between what should be and what was, that gap had defined his entire life. But here's what Leonardo didn't know, couldn't know, standing in that garden watching birds. Couldn't know because he died too soon, because his notebooks were scattered and unread, because the world hadn't yet caught up to his thinking. What he didn't know was that he had changed everything. That his observations about flight, his drawings of helicopters and parachutes and gliders, his understanding of lift and drag and air pressure, all of it had been recorded, was waiting, would be discovered, would inspire the people who finally did achieve flight. The Wright brothers wouldn't read Leonardo's notebooks. They were still unpublished in 1903. But they were walking a path Leonardo had cleared, asking questions he had asked, thinking in ways he had established were possible. The helicopter would fly in 1936, looking remarkably like Leonardo's aerial screw. The parachute would save thousands of lives using his design. The hang gliders and ultralights and wingsuits that would let humans soar like birds, all of them traced conceptual lineage back to Leonardo's obsession. He didn't fail. He was just early. So early that success looked like failure from where he stood. But from where we stand 500 years later, we can see the truth. We can see that everything Leonardo touched, he transformed. That his poverty didn't limit him. It liberated him from the conventional paths that would have constrained a lesser mind. That his illegitimacy didn't diminish him. It freed him from the social expectations that would have made him ordinary. That his inability to finish projects wasn't weakness. It was evidence of a mind too large for any single work to contain. That his obsessive notebook keeping wasn't procrastination. It was the creation of a knowledge base that would educate humanity for centuries. Leonardo da Vinci survived brutal poverty to paint and invent everything. But more than that, he survived to show us what human potential looked like when unleashed. What curiosity could achieve when followed relentlessly. What one mind could accomplish when freed from limitations, even if that mind never fully understood its own accomplishments. He died thinking he had failed, and in dying he succeeded beyond any measure he could have imagined. His body returned to dust, but his mind became immortal. His vision became reality. His dreams became blueprints. His observations became sciences. His questions became our inheritance. And somewhere, in the space between what he was and what he became, between the suffering he endured and the inspiration he provides, between the poverty that broke him and the genius that emerged from those broken pieces, there's a truth about human existence. About what we're capable of. About what we survive. About how the things that should destroy us sometimes transform us instead. About how the bastard child from nowhere can become everything if he just refuses to stop looking at the world with wonder. If he just keeps asking why. If he just keeps drawing what he sees and seeing what others miss and missing nothing because every moment is precious and every observation matters and every question deserves an answer. Man doesn't fly because he has wings. He flies because he cannot stop looking at the sky. Because something in us refuses to accept limitation. Refuses to believe that what is must always be. Refuses to let gravity or poverty or illegitimacy or age or failure or the world's indifference determine what's possible. We fly because people like Leonardo looked at birds and didn't see the impossibility of human flight. They saw a problem to solve. A mystery to decode. A challenge that demanded response. And they worked on it until their bodies failed, until their hands couldn't hold brushes anymore, until death finally stopped them. And even then they didn't really stop. Because the work survived. The notes survived. The drawings survived. The questions survived. And every generation that followed picked up those questions and carried them forward. Refined them. Answered some. Generated new ones. Kept the flame burning. The flame that Leonardo lit in a hillside village in Tuscany in 1452, born to a mother who didn't matter and a father who was ashamed, that flame has never gone out. It burns in every artist who pursues truth over beauty, in every engineer who combines creativity with calculation, in every anatomist who sees wonder in flesh, in every person who keeps a notebook and fills it with observations, in every child who asks why and refuses to accept because that's how it is as an answer, in every curious mind that looks at the world and sees not just what is, but what could be, what should be, what will be if we're brave enough to pursue it. That's Leonardo's legacy. Not the paintings though they matter, not the inventions though they're remarkable, but the permission he gave us, the example he set, the proof he provided that one human being, armed with nothing but curiosity and perseverance and the refusal to accept limitation, can change the world, can echo across centuries, can become immortal not through fame or wealth or power, but through the simple act of paying attention, of looking carefully, of asking questions, of pursuing understanding as if it were the most important thing in the world. Because for Leonardo it was survival, it was meaning. It was the only thing that made the suffering bearable. And it turned out to be enough. More than enough. It turned out to be everything. The water ripples endlessly outward from where the feather fell. We're still feeling the waves,